Chapter 1. Unbent Knees and Unbroken Promises. The smell of ozone and burning silk was the first thing that registered. The second was the excruciating ache in the back of Alexander Vance's head. He didn't open his eyes immediately. A lifetime of climbing from a poverty-stricken orphan to the most feared corporate liquidator in the hemisphere had taught him one fundamental truth. When thrown into an unfamiliar environment, the person who moves first usually dies first. "Look at him!" A voice sneered above him, shrill and dripping with aristocratic disdain. The high and mighty scion of Ravenwood, swooning like a tavern wench because the crown prince frowned at him. "Get up, Sylvester. The emperor approaches." "Sylvester?" Alexander opened his eyes, his gaze cold, deliberate, and entirely devoid of the confusion one might expect from a man who had just died of a cardiac arrest at his mahogany desk in Manhattan. He was lying on a polished marble floor that reflected the vaulted, gold-leaf ceiling high above. Surrounding him were men and women dressed in absurdly extravagant velvet doublets, corsets stiffened with whalebone, and silks dyed in shades of deep sapphire and crimson. A flood of memories, foreign, frantic, and pathetically shallow, stamped itself onto his mind. He was no longer Alexander Vance. He was Sylvester von Ravenwood, the 22-year-old eldest son of the Duke of Ravenwood. In the trashy web novel Alexander had skimmed during a rare hour of downtime, Sylvester was a minor, arrogant villain. A pawn meant to be crushed early on to demonstrate the ruthlessness of the male lead, Crown Prince Cassian. In the novel's original timeline, right at this very moment, Sylvester had been framed for embezzling funds from the Imperial Armory. Panicked and desperate, the original Sylvester had thrown himself at the Crown Prince's feet, weeping, begging for mercy, and kissing the hem of the royal robes. Cassian had simply stepped on his hand, breaking 3 fingers, before dragging him to the dungeons. Alexander, now Sylvester, slowly pushed himself up. He dusted off the front of his midnight black frock coat, his movements measured and elegant. "Did you not hear me, you dog?" The voice belonged to Viscount Julian, a sycophant who spent most of his days trailing behind the crown prince like an eager hound. Julian reached out, a claw-like hand extending to grab Sylvester's collar to force him down. "Kneel before the Grand Chamberlains enter. You are a traitor awaiting judgment." Sylvester didn't flinch. As Julian's hand drew near, Sylvester caught the man's wrist in a grip like forged steel. He didn't slam him or scream. He simply squeezed, pinpointing the median nerve with surgical precision. Julian gasped, his eyes widening in shock as his arm went entirely numb, his knees buckling under the sudden, agonizing pressure. "Touch me again," Sylvester said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that cut through the murmurs of the surrounding court like a razor through satin. "And I will ensure the only thing your fingers ever hold again is a beggar's cup." He released Julian, who stumbled back into the arms of 2 startled barons, clutching his trembling wrist in terror. The great hall of the imperial palace went dead silent. The nobles stared. This was not the sniveling, desperate boy who had been hyperventilating 10 minutes ago. The posture was different. The shoulders were squared, the spine erect, and the eyes, previously watery and panicked, were now a freezing, icy blue, radiating a calm, predatory intellect. "Make way for His Imperial Highness, Crown Prince Cassian von Astria," the herald's voice boomed, echoing off the high stone pillars. The massive oak doors at the end of the hall swung open. Every noble in the room instantly dropped to their knees, bowing their heads until their foreheads nearly touched the cold marble. It was a sign of absolute submission to the tyrant of the Austrian Empire. Sylvester stayed standing. He didn't just stand. He smoothed his cuffs, rested his left hand casually on the pommel of his decorative rapier, and watched the grand entry with mild amusement. Down the velvet carpet walked Crown Prince Cassian. He was a vision of terrifying grandeur, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, clad in black and gold armor, with the obsidian-hilted broadsword at his hip. His crimson eyes swept over the kneeling crowd, utterly indifferent to their worship. Then his gaze halted. Standing in the sea of prostrate bodies, like a solitary obsidian tower in a flat desert, was Sylvester. Cassian's eyes narrowed. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet as the prince's aura. A thick, suffocating pressure born of years on the blood-soaked front lines, flared outward. Several lesser nobles gasped, struggling to breathe under the weight of the prince's intent. Sylvester felt the pressure. It was like an iron weight pressing down on his ribs, demanding he bend, demanding he break. Charming, Sylvester thought, a dictatorial bully with a flair for dramatics. Instead of bowing, Sylvester casually took 2 steps forward, crossing his ankles and resting his weight on one leg, looking every bit like a man waiting for a slightly delayed train. He looked Cassian straight in the eyes, a faint, mocking smile touching the corner of his lips. Cassian stopped 10 feet away. The sheer audacity of the man before him was a blasphemy the court had never witnessed. "Sylvester von Ravenwood," Cassian said, his voice deep, resonant, and dripping with lethal promise. "You dare stand in my presence? You dare refuse to bow to the blood of the dragon?" "Your Highness," Sylvester replied smoothly, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather over tea. "I bow to 3 things: supreme logic, immense ambition, and my own desires. Royalty, if you'll forgive the bluntness, is merely an accident of birth. It commands my acknowledgement, not my spine." A collective gasp echoed through the court. Julian looked as if he might faint from joy, convinced Sylvester had just signed his own execution warrant. Cassian's hand rested on the pommel of his sword. "You are accused of treason. The ledgers of the Imperial Armory show a deficit of 400,000 gold sovereigns, transferred directly into the Ravenwood offshore accounts under your seal. You stand here a ruined man, facing the block. And yet you speak of pride." "I speak of facts," Sylvester corrected, taking a slow step toward the prince. Cassian's personal guards instantly drew their steel, but Cassian raised a single hand, stopping them. He was fascinated. The boy before him was completely devoid of fear. "First," Sylvester began, holding up a slender finger, "me stealing 400,000 gold pieces is mathematically absurd. The Ravenwood estate generates twice that in quarterly timber exports alone. Why would I ruin a dynasty for pocket change?" "Your seal is on the drafts," Cassian noted coldly. A seal carved from soft brass, kept in an unlocked drawer in the eastern wing, which Viscount Julian accessed 3 nights ago during the midsummer gala, Sylvester said, turning his sharp gaze toward the trembling Viscount. Julian went pale. "Lies. Slander. Your Highness, he is insane." "Second," Sylvester continued, ignoring Julian completely as he reached into his inner coat pocket. The guards flinched, but Sylvester merely pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, an item he had mentally compiled using the original body's scattered memories combined with his own master-level accounting expertise. "The armory isn't missing 400,000 sovereigns due to theft. It is missing due to systemic gross incompetence." Sylvester opened the book and began reading, his voice crisp and sharp. 3 years ago, the War Ministry signed a supply contract with the Guild of Ironmasters. You paid 12 silver pieces per broadsword. The market rate for raw iron fell 30% last winter, yet the ministry continued paying the inflated rate, pocketing the margin under maintenance fees. "The missing gold wasn't stolen by me, Your Highness. It was laundered by your own Minister of War to buy land in the southern provinces." Sylvester snapped the notebook shut with a sharp clack. "If you execute me today, you kill the only man in this room smart enough to tell you that your military treasury will be completely bankrupt before the winter campaign even begins." Silence fell over the hall once more. Heavy, suffocating silence. The Minister of War, an elder duke sitting near the front, sweat profusely, his eyes darting toward the exits. Cassian didn't look at the minister. His crimson eyes were locked entirely on Sylvester. For the first time in his life, Cassian felt something entirely foreign in an imperial court. Genuine, unadulterated intrigue. The sniveling weakling he had expected had vanished, replaced by a ruthless strategist who had just dismantled an imperial conspiracy in under 3 minutes, all while refusing to bend a single knee. Cassian stepped closer, stopping mere inches from Sylvester. He was taller, broader, radiating physical danger. You are arrogant, Sylvester. What makes you think I won't kill you simply for your insolence? Sylvester didn't step back. He tilted his head up slightly, meeting the Crown Prince's deadly gaze with an amused, dominant spark of his own. He reached out, a move so bold it made the Grand Chamberlain faint, and casually patted a speck of dust off the prince's golden epaulette. Sylvester smirked, a dangerous, mesmerizing expression. And frankly, you can't afford me, but I'm willing to offer a free trial. Cassian stared at him. Then, slowly, a low, dark chuckle rumbled in the Crown Prince's chest, a sound no one in the court had heard in over 5 years. A free trial? Cassian repeated, his eyes burning with an intense, possessive light. You talk a grand game, Ravenwood. Very well. You have 3 days to prove the minister's guilt and recover the gold. If you succeed, the armory is yours to manage. And if I fail? Sylvester asked smoothly. Then I will personally cut off your head, Cassian replied, leaning in until his breath brushed against Sylvester's ear. And it will break my heart, because I haven't found a toy this interesting in a very long time. Sylvester merely laughed, stepping back and giving the Crown Prince a lazy, casual nod, still not bowing an inch. Deal. But remember, Your Highness. Sylvester turned on his heel, his midnight coat billowing behind him as he walked toward the grand exit, the kneeling court scrambling to part like the Red Sea before him. I don't play the role of a toy. If you want to play a game with me, prepare to lose. Chapter 2: The Art of the Hostile Takeover. The Ravenwood estate in the capital was a monument to old money and fading relevance. High stone arches, black marble pillars, and tapestries detailing ancient battle victories lined the hallways. It was impressive to an outsider, but to Sylvester, it was simply an underperforming asset with abysmal cash flow. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk in his private study, Sylvester poured himself a crystal glass of aged brandy. He took a slow sip, letting the burning liquor settle his mind as he reviewed the stacks of parchments spread out before him. Young master, his butler, Benedict, stammered, his voice trembling as he poured more ink into the well. Benedict was a loyal old servant who had spent the last 3 years watching Sylvester spend his allowance on gambling, fine wines, and frivolous court rivalries. The War Ministry. Duke Valerius is a veteran of the northern marches. He commands the loyalty of 3 grand regiments. To publicly accuse him in the imperial court is the most efficient way to break his leverage, Sylvester interrupted without looking up. His pen moved across a blank ledger with mechanical precision, translating modern double-entry bookkeeping concepts into the clumsy financial scripts of this fantasy realm. Efficiency won't stop an assassin's blade. Young master. Benedict wrung his hands. The Duke's men will be coming for your throat before dawn. Let them come, Sylvester said coldly, setting his quill down. An assassin is just an unannounced business meeting. If Duke Valerius sends murderers, it proves he has no legal defense left. Panic makes people predictable, Benedict, and predictable people are effortless to ruin. Sylvester stood up, walking toward the grand bay window that overlooked the rain-slicked courtyard below. He didn't care about Duke Valerius, nor did he fear Crown Prince Cassian's sword. In his previous life as a corporate liquidator, he had faced billion-dollar cartels, crooked politicians, and ruthless boardroom tycoons who would have eaten the nobles of this empire alive. The principle remained the same. Find where the money flows, find where the rot lies, and seize control of the supply chain. A soft rustle of silk sounded from the dark corner of the room. Sylvester didn't turn around. He simply raised his glass toward the reflection in the window glass. You're 3 minutes late, Your Highness, Sylvester said smoothly. For an absolute monarch in training, your punctuality leaves much to be desired. Out of the shadows stepped Crown Prince Cassian. He had shed his heavy ceremonial armor, wearing a simple fitted black tunic that emphasized his broad shoulders and dangerous, predatory build. His silver hair fell loosely around his face, and his crimson eyes glinted in the dim candlelight. Cassian's hand rested casually on his hip near his blade. My shadow guards were supposed to secure this perimeter. How did you know I was here? Shadow magic displaces the air pressure, creating a slight draft, Sylvester replied, turning around to face the prince. He picked up a second glass, poured a measure of brandy, and held it out toward the most dangerous man in the empire. Plus, you smell like expensive leather and fresh blood. Did you slaughter Valerius's scouts on your way in? Cassian looked at the offered glass, then at Sylvester's entirely unbothered face. He took the glass, his leather-gloved fingers brushing against Sylvester's bare knuckles. A faint spark of electric tension snapped between them. 3 of the War Ministry's elite hitmen were waiting in your garden, Cassian said, taking a sip of the liquor. His eyes locked onto Sylvester's with an intense, probing scrutiny. I killed them. Consider it a courtesy to my new investment. How generous, Sylvester drawled, completely unawed by the prince's proximity. Though unnecessary, I had already rigged the fountain with liquid fire distillate. They would have been incinerated the moment they stepped over the marble lip. Cassian paused, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his sharp features. You really are a psychopath, aren't you? The previous Sylvester cried when his horse broke a leg. The previous Sylvester was an idiot who suffered from a terminal lack of vision, Sylvester said flatly. He walked past Cassian, deliberately stepping into the prince's personal space, forcing the taller man to tilt his head to keep eye contact. I am not him, and if you came here expecting a grateful victim to fall at your feet, Cassian, you're going to be severely disappointed. Cassian's crimson eyes flared. In a motion faster than a strike of lightning, he closed the distance, trapping Sylvester against the edge of the heavy mahogany desk. He leaned over him, his immense physical presence slamming into Sylvester like a physical wall. You speak to me without respect, Sylvester, Cassian whispered, his voice dropping into a guttural, velvety register that vibrated against Sylvester's chest. You call me by my name. You stand tall while the entire continent grovels. Do you truly believe your clever little ledger protects you from my blade? Sylvester didn't flinch. He didn't pull back. Instead, he leaned in, his icy blue eyes staring directly into Cassian's crimson gaze without a single drop of fear. Sylvester raised his hand, placing his palm flat against the prince's chest, right over his beating heart. He felt the heavy, steady rhythm of a tyrant's pulse. Your blade is useless against me, Cassian, Sylvester said softly, his voice dripping with smooth, dominant confidence. Because you don't want to kill me. You are bored. You've conquered every battlefield, executed every enemy, and broken every noble who dared look at you sideways. You are surrounded by pathetic, trembling sheep. Sylvester's fingers flexed slightly against Cassian's tunic, pulling the prince an inch closer. You don't want my head on a spike, Sylvester smirked, his lips hovering dangerously close to Cassian's jaw. You want to see if there is a man in this empire capable of standing beside you as an equal. You want a storm, Cassian, and I am the biggest hurricane you will ever encounter. Cassian's breath hitched. For a second, the iron-willed crown prince, the bloodthirsty monster of Estria, looked genuinely stunned. A hot, dark rush of desire slammed through his veins, far more intoxicating than any victory on the battlefield. Sylvester didn't want the prince's protection. Sylvester wanted to conquer the empire on his own terms, and he was daring the prince to try and stop him. Cassian reached up, his gloved hand catching Sylvester's chin in a firm, possessive grip. If you fail to deliver Valerius's head on a platter by tomorrow night, I will personally lock you in the Imperial Tower, Sylvester. Not to execute you, but to keep you. Sylvester chuckled, reaching up to slap Cassian's hand away with crisp authority. Keep dreamin', Your Highness, Sylvester said, turning back toward his papers. Now, if you're done playing the brooding overlord, sit down and shut up. I'm going to show you how we're going to bankrupt the War Ministry before breakfast. Chapter 3, Checkmate in Midnight Silk. The War Ministry was a fortress built of cold gray granite, designed to withstand siege engines and dragon fire. Yet, as Sylvester walked through its iron-reinforced gates at 2 in the morning, he didn't need a battering ram. He simply held a scroll sealed with imperial black wax. Behind him marched a dozen imperial knights, their heavy plate armor clanking against the wet cobblestones. Cassian walked silently at Sylvester's left, wearing a heavy velvet cloak that shadowed his face, content for the moment to play the role of an observer in Sylvester's symphony of destruction. "This is an outrage," Duke Valerius roared, slamming his heavy fists onto his oak desk as the heavy double doors of his private office were kicked open. The Minister of War was a bear of a man, scarred from decades on the northern border, his eyes wild with rage and alcohol. "You dare breach the war ministry in the dead of night, Ravenwood? I will have your skin flayed for this treason." Sylvester didn't bother to answer the threat. He walked into the lavishly decorated office, his eyes casually scanning the gilded tapestries, the crystal decanters, and the rack of priceless ceremonial weapons. "Charming decor," Sylvester remarked dryly, pulling off his black leather gloves finger by finger. "Purchased, no doubt, with the 40,000 sovereigns diverted from the winter rations of the 4th Border Legion." Valerius went pale, though he quickly masked it with a ferocious sneer. "You speak nonsensical slander. The ledgers were audited by the Crown's own scribes." "Ah yes, Master Scribe Oates," Sylvester said, taking a seat in the velvet armchair opposite the Duke's desk without being invited. He crossed his legs elegantly, resting his elbows on the arms of the chair. "A lovely man. A pity about his gambling debt at the Golden Rose Casino. It's amazing how quickly an auditor loses his eyesight when 300 gold pieces vanish from his ledger to settle his tab." Sylvester snapped his fingers. Benedict, who was trembling behind the Imperial Knights, stepped forward and laid a thick leather folder on the desk. "What is this trash?" Valerius demanded, glaring at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "That is your obituary, financially speaking," Sylvester smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the razor-sharp grin of an apex predator closing in on a wounded deer. "Inside, you will find a complete record of every ghost shipment, every inflated iron contract, and every shell company registered under your bastard son's name in the southern port of Oakhaven over the past 4 years. You couldn't have gathered this," Valerius shouted, his voice cracking. "The books are encrypted." "They were," Sylvester agreed smoothly, "using a simple substitution cipher based on ancient High Valyrian military manuals. Took my head accountant 20 minutes to break it. Honestly, Duke, your corruption is as lazy as your military tactics." Valerius's eyes darted toward the wall where his heavy battle axe hung. His hand twitched toward his belt, where a concealed dagger rested. He was a veteran soldier. He knew he was trapped. If these papers reached the Emperor, his entire family line would be executed, their noble blood wiped from the imperial registries. "You think you can ruin me, boy?" Valerius growled, his voice dropping into a dangerous, low guttural tone. "You think some numbers on parchment give you power over me? I have 50 loyal guards in this building. One shout, and you and your scribes will be dog food." Sylvester didn't move. He didn't reach for a sword. He simply tilted his head, looking at the towering warlord with an expression of profound, almost pitying boredom. "Call them," Sylvester said softly. Valerius blinked, stunned. "What?" "Call them," Sylvester repeated, leaning forward, his icy blue eyes pinning Valerius to his chair. "Shout for your guards. Tell them to cut us down. But before you open your mouth, let me tell you what happens next." Sylvester held up a single finger. "First, the Imperial Bank has already frozen your personal vault as of 20 minutes ago under my emergency decree. Second, the Blacksmiths Guild in the lower district has been informed that your personal guarantee on their iron supplies is fraudulent. They are currently seizing your private estates in the countryside to cover their losses. Third, the guards outside this room aren't yours anymore. I paid their commander 3 months of back pay out of my own pocket an hour ago. Money you stole from them. They aren't going to save you, Valerius. They are waiting for me to give the word so they can drag you to the dungeons." Valerius stared at Sylvester, his chest heaving, cold sweat pouring down his face. The sheer speed, The absolute thoroughness of the trap was horrifying. Sylvester hadn't just accused him. He had stripped him of his wealth, his influence, and his protection before Valerius even realized a war had begun. You monster, Valerius whispered, collapsing back into his chair, all the fire leaving his body. From the shadowy corner of the room, Cassian stepped forward, letting his dark hood fall back over his shoulders. His silver hair shimmered in the candlelight, his crimson eyes burning with a terrifying, ecstatic thrill. Cassian hadn't said a single word the entire night. He had watched Sylvester execute a completely bloodless, absolute coup d'état in under 10 minutes using nothing but words, ledgers, and cold, ruthless logic. Cassian walked up behind Sylvester's chair, resting both of his broad, gloved hands on the wooden backrest, hovering right behind Sylvester's head. The prince looked down at Sylvester, his heart pounding against his ribs with a dark, suffocating obsession. "Impressive," Cassian murmured, his deep voice vibrating right behind Sylvester's ear. "You didn't even draw steel, and yet you've slaughtered an imperial duke." Sylvester didn't turn around, though he felt the heat of Cassian's massive body radiating against his back. He picked up his gloves and slowly pulled them back over his long, slender fingers. "Steel is messy, Cassian," Sylvester replied calmly, his voice smooth as silk. "Money and information cut deeper, never dull, and leave no blood on my tailored coats." Sylvester stood up, turning to face the crown prince. They were mere inches apart. Cassian looked down at him, his red eyes blazing with a mixture of royal dominance and undeniable hunger. "You've won your bet, Sylvester," Cassian said, his voice dropping low, intended for Sylvester's ears alone. "The war ministry is yours. The armory is yours. But you know what this means, don't you? It means I've saved your empire 400,000 gold pieces." Sylvester smirked, reaching out with a single gloved finger to tap Cassian right over his heart. "You owe me, your highness." Cassian caught Sylvester's wrist in a grip that could crush iron. But instead of squeezing, Cassian raised Sylvester's hand, resting his lips lightly against the black leather covering Sylvester's knuckles. "Name your price, my arrogant little lord," Cassian whispered, his crimson eyes locking onto Sylvester's with intense, unyielding possession. "Ask for land. Ask for titles. Ask for gold." Sylvester didn't pull his hand away. He simply smiled, a cold, beautiful, dominant expression that made the crown prince's breath catch in his throat. "I don't want your land or your gold, Cassian," Sylvester said, pulling his hand back with effortless grace. "I want full authority over the imperial treasury. No royal oversight, no ministers, just me." Sylvester turned toward the door, his midnight coat sweeping behind him as he stepped over the ruined duke. "And remember, Cassian," Sylvester called back over his shoulder without looking back, "if you ever try to put a leash on me, I'll take your empire next." Chapter 4: The Price of Absolute Power. The imperial treasury was not a room. It was a fortress within a fortress, buried 3 levels beneath the grand palace. It smelled of ancient stone, dry parchment, and the cold metallic scent of millions of gold coins stacked in towering vaults. Sylvester stood at the center of the grand chamber, surrounded by mountain-high stacks of ledgers, tax rolls, and trade agreements. A dozen senior clerks, men who had spent 40 years managing the empire's wealth, stood in a trembling semicircle before him. "This is unacceptable," Sylvester said, his voice quiet, devoid of anger, but carrying an edge that made the eldest clerk flinch. Sylvester dropped a thick parchment ledger onto the iron-bound table between them. The heavy thud echoed in the vaulted ceiling like a crack of thunder. "You are levying a 40% grain tax on the western provinces during a drought year," Sylvester continued, walking slowly down the line of clerks, his boots clicking rhythmically against the stone floor. "Do you know what happens when you tax starving peasants at 40%? It generates 60,000 gold for the summer garrison, my lord," the chief accountant stuttered, wiping sweat from his balding head. "It generates a bloody rebellion that will cost 300,000 gold to put down," Sylvester corrected flatly. He stopped in front of the chief accountant, towering over him with a cold, piercing gaze. You lose 2 harvest cycles, burnt garrisons, and 80,000 dead taxpayers. Your accounting isn't just cruel. It's bad business. Sylvester turned back to the table, picking up a quill and striking 3 long, decisive red lines through the page. Cut the Western grain tax to 15%. Simultaneously, impose a 12% luxury tariff on all imported velvet, wine, and exotic beasts entering the capital through the noble districts. The high nobles will be furious, another clerk squeaked. They will appeal directly to the emperor. Sylvester turned his head, a dark, razor-sharp smirk touching his lips. Let them appeal to the emperor. If any duke complains about paying 2 extra silver pieces for his velvet trousers, send him to my office. I will personally review his estate's tax exemptions over the last decade. I assure you, he will leave my office begging to pay 20% instead. The clerks exchanged terrified glances, bowed frantically, and scrambled to execute his orders like men fleeing a burning building. Sylvester took a slow breath, adjusting his dark silk cravat. Modern corporate restructuring was identical to managing a feudal empire. It was simply a matter of identifying the parasites and starving them out. A sudden, faint rustle of shadow made Sylvester's eyes narrow. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't scream for guards. Sylvester simply leaned back against the edge of the heavy oak desk, resting his ankles, and took a slow sip of cold water from a silver goblet. If you're going to stalk me into the underworld, Cassian, at least bring a better vintage than what's in the palace cellars, Sylvester said aloud to the empty, torchlit room. From the dark corridor leading to the lower vaults, Crown Prince Cassian emerged. He was dressed in his black combat tunic, a heavy crimson cloak draped over one shoulder. His long silver hair was tied back, highlighting his razor-sharp jawline and the intense, smoldering red of his eyes. Cassian walked slowly toward Sylvester, his heavy leather boots making no sound against the stone. The sheer, physical oppression of his presence filled the underground hall, but Sylvester merely watched him with mild, aristocratic amusement. You've been in the treasury for 36 hours without sleep, Cassian noted, stopping just a foot away from Sylvester. His gaze swept over Sylvester's pristine coat, taking in the sharp angle of his jaw and the cold, unyielding fire in his blue eyes. My shadow guards report that you haven't eaten a full meal since yesterday morning. Sleep is an inefficiency when one is fixing 20 years of imperial stupidity, Sylvester replied smoothly. He looked up into Cassian's eyes, refusing to step back even as the prince moved closer. And why are you monitoring my meals, your highness? Have you added imperial nanny to your list of titles? Cassian reached out, his long, calloused fingers catching Sylvester by the chin. His grip was firm, dominant, yet careful enough not to leave a bruise. He tilted Sylvester's head up, thumb resting against the sharp line of his jaw. I monitor what belongs to me, Cassian murmured, his deep, resonant voice vibrating against Sylvester's skin. And right now, the man holding the throat of my empire's economy is running himself into the ground. Sylvester didn't flinch from the touch. Instead, he raised his own hand, his slender fingers wrapping firmly around Cassian's wrist. He didn't pull Cassian's hand away. He squeezed, leaning in until their noses were barely an inch apart. I don't belong to you, Cassian, Sylvester whispered, his voice low, velvety, and entirely devoid of submission. The treasury is mine because I took it. The war ministry fell because I broke it. You rule the army, but I hold the keys to the kingdom's heart. If I stop breathing, this entire empire starves in 3 months. Cassian's crimson eyes flared with a dark, intoxicating hunger. He didn't pull back. The utter lack of fear in Sylvester, the absolute defiance in the face of a man who could snap his neck in a heartbeat, drove the crown prince insane with desire. Cassian leaned down, his lips brushing against Sylvester's ear, his hot breath making a subtle shiver run down Sylvester's spine, though Sylvester refused to show it. Then live, Sylvester, Cassian growled softly, his hand moving from Sylvester's chin to the nape of his neck. his fingers tangling into Sylvester's dark hair, holding him in place. Live and rule the shadows as much as you want. But do not think for a single second that I will let you slip through my fingers. Sylvester smirked, his eyes sparkling with a cold, predatory light. He brought his free hand up, resting his palm flat against Cassian's chest, feeling the heavy, thunderous pulse beneath the prince's tunic. You can try to hold me, your highness, Sylvester whispered back, his thumb rubbing a slow, mocking circle against Cassian's chest. But remember, every trap you set for me only makes me want to burn your cage down. Cassian let out a dark, breathless chuckle, his grip tightening in Sylvester's hair for a brief, electric moment before he released him, stepping back with a slow, dangerous smile. Dinner is waiting in the high tower, Sylvester. You will join me. Is that a command, your highness? Sylvester asked, casually straightening his coat and brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. Try it, Cassian, Sylvester threw back over his shoulder. And see how much I charge you for the privilege. It is an invitation, Cassian corrected, his crimson eyes locking onto Sylvester's with absolute intensity. And if you refuse, I will simply carry you there myself. Sylvester scoffed lightly, though a small, amused glint danced in his eyes as he walked past the crown prince toward the stairs. Chapter 5. A Sovereign Dinner. The Grand Spire was the highest point in the imperial palace, a soaring tower of pale ivory stone that overlooked the flickering lights of the entire capital. Ordinarily, the high dining hall was reserved for visiting foreign monarchs or grand victory celebrations. Tonight it was set for two. Sylvester walked in, his footsteps measured and silent against the polished obsidian floor. He wore a crisp, tailored jacket of slate gray velvet with silver embroidery down the lapels, looking every bit like a king in his own right. In the center of the vast, arched room sat a long table made of polished dark mahogany, laden with silver platters, roasted meats, candied fruits, and decanters of rich, dark wine. At the head of the table sat Cassian. The crown prince had traded his dark combat gear for a sweeping tunic of deep navy, trimmed with gold thread, though he still carried the dangerous, effortless grace of a predator at rest. He was swirling a glass of deep violet wine, his crimson eyes locking onto Sylvester the moment he crossed the threshold. You're late, Cassian said smoothly, setting his glass down with a soft click. I was finishing a directive to seize the Duke of York's illegal silver mines, Sylvester replied without an ounce of apology. He walked over to the table, ignoring the elaborate chair set at the far end, a seat clearly positioned to make him feel like a subordinate guest. Instead, Sylvester pulled out the heavy carved chair directly to Cassian's right, sliding into it with fluid, unhurried grace. He sat mere inches from the crown prince, turning to face him head-on. Cassian's eyebrows rose slightly, a faint, amused spark dancing in his red eyes. That chair is reserved for the imperial consort or the Grand Duke. Then you should thank me for upgrading your company, Sylvester drawled, reaching for a crystal goblet and pouring himself a measure of the violet wine. He took a small sip, letting the notes of spiced plum and oak rest on his tongue before nodding approvingly. Not bad. A 1482 Valencian reserve. I see you have some taste beyond slaughtering rebellion armies. I have excellent taste, Cassian said, his voice dropping an octave as his eyes dragged slowly over Sylvester's face, taking in the clean line of his jaw and the sharp, brilliant blue of his eyes. Which is precisely why I invited you here. To feed your new treasurer? Sylvester asked, slicing a piece of seared venison with clinical precision. Or to measure how much leash you think you can put around my neck? Neither, Cassian replied, leaning back in his throne-like chair, his gaze unyielding. I wanted to see if the boldest man in Astria could relax for even an hour without plotting a hostile takeover. Plotting hostile takeovers is my version of relaxing, Sylvester said, chewing elegantly before looking up. Besides, resting invites complacency. Complacency leads to mistakes. And I don't make mistakes. No, Cassian murmured, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the dark mahogany table. The sudden shift brought him into Sylvester's immediate space, his broad shoulders casting a shadowed canopy over Sylvester. You make moves. Precise, bloody moves that rewrite the political map before anyone else even realizes the game has started. Cassian reached out, his bare fingers long and calloused, hovering just above Sylvester's hand where it rested near his glass. The court is terrified of you, Sylvester. Cassian continued, a dark, low rumble in his voice that felt like purring thunder. The ministers are whispering that the Ravenwood boy is possessed by a demon of cold steel. They say you don't sleep, you don't bleed, and you don't bend. Sylvester didn't pull his hand away. He let Cassian's fingers slide forward until the prince's hot, callous skin brushed against his knuckles. The contrast between Cassian's fiery heat and Sylvester's cool demeanor was electric. Let them whisper, Sylvester said, his voice steady, a lazy, dominant smirk curving his lips. Fear is a wonderful motivator. It keeps the corrupt honest and the foolish quiet. And what about me? Cassian asked, his eyes darkening as his thumb stroked a slow, deliberate line over the back of Sylvester's hand. Should I fear you too, Sylvester? Sylvester turned his hand over, catching Cassian's fingers in his own grip. He leaned in closer, his face stopping inches from Cassian's broad cheek, his icy blue eyes gleaming with absolute, unwavering dominance. You shouldn't fear me, Cassian, Sylvester whispered, his warm breath brushing against the prince's jawline. You should respect me, because the moment you treat me like a subordinate, I will dismantle your throne block by block, and sell the scrap metal back to you at a 200% markup. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched across the high dining hall. Then, Cassian let out a deep, echoing laugh, a rich, genuine sound that shook his broad chest and shattered the tense atmosphere. He flipped his hand, gripping Sylvester's fingers tightly, pulling Sylvester just a fraction closer. Gods, you are incredible, Cassian breathed, his crimson eyes burning with a raw, undeniable obsession. Every man in this empire wants my favor, my protection, or my crown. And here you sit, threatening to liquidate my kingdom over dinner. I don't make idle threats, Your Highness, Sylvester smirked, casually disengaging his hand and picking up his wine glass once more. I make financial forecasts. Then forecast this, Cassian said softly, leaning back, though his gaze never left Sylvester's face for a fraction of a second. Tomorrow, the imperial envoy from the northern barbarians arrives. They demand 30,000 head of cattle and 10 tons of iron in tribute, or they break the border peace. Sylvester took a slow, leisurely sip of wine, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. Tell them no, Sylvester said flatly. They have 100,000 horse archers on the border. Cassian noted, testing him. And they have no salt reserves for the coming winter. Sylvester countered instantly, a cold, genius spark flashing in his eyes. Ban all salt exports to the north by midnight. In 3 weeks, their meat rots, their horses die of mineral deficiency, and their chieftain will be crawling to the capital on his hands and knees, begging to sell us his iron for copper coins. Cassian stared at Sylvester. The sheer, effortless speed with which Sylvester had just broken a major geopolitical threat was almost terrifying. Slowly, a dark, possessive grin spread across Cassian's face. He raised his own glass toward Sylvester in a quiet, solemn toast. To my treasurer, Cassian murmured. Sylvester clinked his glass against the prince's, his expression utterly unreadable, overflowing with supreme confidence. To your master, Sylvester corrected smoothly. Chapter 6. A Negotiation of Flesh. The thunderstorm over the capital had raged for 3 hours, driving sheets of freezing rain against the high stained-glass bay windows of Sylvester's private estate quarters. Inside, the room was bathed in the warm, flickering glow of a single hearth fire. Sylvester sat at his low velvet lounge couch, wearing only an unbuttoned white silk shirt and dark trousers. His hair was slightly damp, falling across his forehead, but his eyes were as clear, sharp, and calculated as ever as he reviewed the northern salt trade ledgers. The heavy oak door didn't knock. It simply swung open under the weight of an absolute authority that recognized no lock. Cassian stepped inside, shedding his water-soaked velvet cloak and dropping it onto the stone floor with a heavy thud. He was drenched, his silver hair plastered back, revealing the harsh, razor-like contours of his face and the smoldering crimson fire in his eyes. He smelled of rain, ozone, and an electric, dangerous energy that seemed to charge the air in the room instantly. Sylvester didn't jump. He didn't even rush to cover his chest. He simply turned a page of his ledger, taking a slow sip of black tea. "You're tracking rainwater onto my silk carpet, Cassian?" Sylvester said calmly, his baritone voice cutting through the patter of rain against glass. Cassian didn't answer with words. He walked across the room with long, deliberate strides, stopping right in front of the low table. His physical presence was suffocating. A mountain of muscle, authority, and unbridled intensity looking down at the man who had spent the last 2 weeks single-handedly taking over his empire. "The northern chieftains sent their surrender scroll an hour ago," Cassian said, his voice lower than usual, thick with a dark, raspy edge. "They agreed to every term. No salt, no iron. Complete capitulation." "Of course they did," Sylvester replied, setting his tea down and finally looking up, resting his head back against the velvet cushions. "It was the only logical outcome." "You won," Cassian whispered, stepping around the table until he was standing directly over Sylvester, without a single soldier drawing a blade. "You made a kingdom kneel." "I don't care about making them kneel," Sylvester smirked, his icy blue eyes meeting Cassian's crimson glare without a flicker of deference. "I care about results. Now, if you came here to award me a medal, drop it on the table and leave. I have work to do." Cassian let out a low, dark growl. Before Sylvester could move, Cassian leaned down, planting one palm on the back of the couch near Sylvester's head and the other on the wooden frame by his side, trapping Sylvester completely beneath him. The heat radiating off the prince was scorching. "I didn't come to give you a medal, Sylvester," Cassian breathed, his eyes dragging down the exposed line of Sylvester's throat to his half-unbuttoned chest. "I came because I've spent 3 weeks watching you control my court, my treasury, and my generals. And I am sick of watching." Sylvester didn't push him away. He raised an eyebrow, his smirk remaining perfectly intact. "And what do you think you're going to do, Cassian? Take what you want? You know better than that." "I know I can't break you," Cassian growled, leaning down until his lips brushed against the sensitive shell of Sylvester's ear, making Sylvester's pulse quicken despite his iron control. "I know you don't love me, and I don't love you. This isn't about devotion, Sylvester. This is about power. This is about friction." Cassian's hand reached out, catching Sylvester by the back of his neck, his thick fingers tangling into Sylvester's dark hair. He pulled back just enough to look into Sylvester's eyes, searching for fear, finding only a deep, matching hunger. "You want this as much as I do," Cassian rasped. "You want to see if you can handle me. You want to conquer me here just like you conquered my treasury." Sylvester let out a soft, dark chuckle, a sound purely born of a high-stakes thrill. Cassian was right. This wasn't romance. There were no sweet promises, no gentle words, no soft confessions. It was a transaction of dominance between 2 apex predators who had pushed each other to the absolute brink. Sylvester reached up, catching Cassian by the lapel of his wet tunic, and yanked the massive crown prince down into a fierce, suffocating kiss. It was not a soft touch. It was a battle. Their lips met with a bruise-inducing force, a clash of teeth, hot breath, and sharp intake of air. Sylvester didn't yield an inch, his tongue tangling with Cassian's, demanding equal territory, matching Cassian's wild, raw intensity with a sharp, calculated aggression of his own. Cassian groaned into Sylvester's mouth, his hand tightening in Sylvester's hair as he hauled the lighter man up off the couch. In one fluid motion, Cassian shoved the papers and ledgers off the heavy mahogany desk, sending parchment flying through the air, and hoisted Sylvester onto the edge of the wood. Sylvester's silk shirt tore as Cassian yanked it off his shoulders, exposing pale, lean muscle and broad shoulders to the cool air of the room. But Sylvester didn't hesitate. His long fingers dug into Cassian's back, pulling the prince's tunic over his head and tossing it onto the floor, revealing the heavy, scarred chest of the Empire's greatest warrior. "You don't get to command me in this bed, Cassian," Sylvester hissed against the prince's jawline, his teeth nipping sharp enough to draw a tiny drop of blood from Cassian's neck. Cassian hissed in pleasure, his hands gripping Sylvester's hips with brutal force, lifting him slightly, aligning their bodies until there was no space left between them. The heat was unbearable, a chaotic mixture of sweat, friction, and raw physical exertion. "Then fight me for control, Sylvester," Cassian snarled softly, his crimson eyes blazing with an intoxicating, addictive madness as he pushed Sylvester down onto his back against the polished wood. When Cassian took him, it was uncompromising, heavy, and intense. Sylvester threw his head back, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the desk, a ragged, sharp gasp escaping his throat. Every thrust was a demand for surrender. Every arch of Sylvester's back was an absolute refusal to break. Sylvester met every hard, heavy drive with equal force, wrapping his long legs tightly around Cassian's waist, pulling the prince deeper, forcing Cassian to lose the very military composure he prided himself on. Cassian's breath hitched, his rhythm breaking into desperate, primal drives as Sylvester's mouth claimed his collarbone, leaving dark red marks on the prince's skin. They moved together like two storms colliding over a mountain. No sweet whispers, only heavy pants, the sharp slapping of skin, the groan of heavy oak beneath them, and the fierce, possessive grip of four hands seeking to hold the other in place. When the climax hit, it was a shatter of pure electric tension. Cassian buried his face in the crook of Sylvester's neck, his broad back flexing as he poured himself into Sylvester with a muffled growl, his grip on Sylvester's waist tight enough to leave bruised fingerprints. Sylvester dug his nails deep into Cassian's shoulders, his eyes open, watching the mighty prince crumble over him in a state of unadulterated, primal release. For long minutes, the only sound in the room was the torrential rain outside and their heavy, ragged breathing. Cassian didn't move immediately, resting his forehead against Sylvester's chest, his massive heart thudding against Sylvester's ribs like a war drum. Sylvester lay back on the desk, his body flushed, covered in a light sheen of sweat, his chest heaving. Slowly, Sylvester raised a single hand, running his fingers through Cassian's silver hair, pulling the prince's head up until their eyes met again. There was no warmth in Sylvester's blue eyes, only a cold, triumphantly satisfied smirk. "Well, Your Highness," Sylvester murmured, his voice husky, dripping with supreme confidence as he lazily tapped Cassian's jaw. "You put up a decent fight, but the desk still belongs to me." Cassian stared at him, a ragged, breathless laugh escaping his lips. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against Sylvester's, his crimson eyes gleaming with a terrifying, absolute obsession. "You are a terrifying man, Sylvester," Cassian whispered. "I know," Sylvester smirked, pushing Cassian off him and sitting up on the desk, casually smoothing his messy hair back. "Now clean up. We have an empire to run at dawn." Chapter 7, The Master of Coin and Chains. Dawn broke over the Istrian capital not with soft birdsong, but with the sharp, rhythmic scratching of a gold-nibbed quill. The storm had passed, leaving a crisp, freezing morning in its wake. Inside Sylvester's chambers, the fireplace had burned down to glowing embers. Crown Prince Cassian woke slowly, the heavy silk sheets pooling around his waist. He was a man accustomed to waking on cold battlefields with a sword in his hand, yet for the first time in a decade, he woke up in a bed that wasn't his, entirely disarmed. He turned his head. Sitting by the towering bay window, bathed in the pale morning light, was Sylvester. He was already fully dressed in a pristine charcoal gray suit, a silver pocket watch chain glinting against his dark waistcoat. His hair was perfectly styled, his icy blue eyes fixed entirely on a sprawling map of the Empire's trade routes. There was no lingering softness from the night before, no sleepy smile of affection. He looked like a man preparing to go to war. You left the bed. Cassian's voice was a rough, sleep-heavy rumble as he pushed himself up, resting his broad back against the headboard. He didn't bother to cover his scarred, heavily muscled chest. The bed is for sleeping and recreational stress relief, Your Highness. Sylvester replied without looking up from his parchment. I have achieved both. Therefore, lingering would be an inefficient use of my time. Cassian let out a low, dark chuckle, swinging his legs over the edge of the mattress. Any other noble would have been clinging to him this morning, whispering sweet praises, desperate to solidify their new, intimate connection to the future emperor. Sylvester, on the other hand, treated the crown prince of the realm like a one-night distraction. It was infuriating. It was intoxicating. Cassian stood up, crossing the room with the silent grace of a hunting cat. He placed his heavy hands on the back of Sylvester's chair, leaning down until his lips hovered near the shell of Sylvester's ear. You are a cold creature, Sylvester, Cassian murmured, the heat of his body radiating against Sylvester's back. Do you dismiss all your conquests so easily? Only the ones who take too long to get dressed, Sylvester said smoothly, finally setting his quill down. He reached up, blindly catching Cassian's wrist, his grip firm and entirely unyielding. He didn't push the prince away, but he established an immediate boundary. And you need to dress, Cassian. We have a summons. Cassian frowned, pulling back slightly. A summons? Sylvester picked up a heavy parchment scroll sealed with the golden dragon wax of the emperor himself. Delivered 20 minutes ago. The High Council has called an emergency tribunal. It seems the Duke of York and his coalition of aristocratic parasites didn't appreciate my luxury tariffs. They are petitioning your father to have me executed for treasonous overreach. Cassian's crimson eyes instantly darkened, a lethal, murderous intent rolling off him in waves. York dares to move against you? I will take the Shadow Guard and mount his head on the palace gates before breakfast. You will do absolutely nothing, Sylvester said, standing up and turning to face Cassian. He reached out, his slender fingers casually tracing the line of a faded scar on Cassian's chest before giving the prince a firm, dismissive pat. This isn't a battlefield, Cassian. This is a boardroom. You let me handle the boardrooms. Now put your clothes on. You're acting as my visual deterrent today. The Imperial Council chamber was a colossal amphitheater of white marble and gold, designed to intimidate. At the very center sat Emperor Aurelius, an aging but imposing figure draped in heavy golden robes, wearing the dragon crown. Lining the curved benches were the 50 most powerful lords of the Istrian Empire. Today, they were a chorus of unified outrage. He is a tyrant in a tailored coat, the Duke of York shouted, slamming his fist against the mahogany podium. In less than a month, Sylvester von Ravenwood has seized the armory, crippled our private estates with illegal tariffs, and insulted the nobility. He uses the crown prince's favor as a shield. We demand his immediate removal from the treasury and a trial by blood. Murmurs of furious agreement echoed through the chamber. The emperor raised a weary hand, rubbing his temples. Before the emperor could speak, the towering oak doors of the chamber swung open with a resounding crash. The guards didn't announce him. They didn't need to. Sylvester walked down the center aisle, his footfalls echoing in the sudden, dead silence of the room. He walked with a terrifying, unhurried elegance, his head held high, his gaze sweeping over the furious nobles with absolute, clinical disdain. 2 steps behind him walked Crown Prince Cassian, a towering shadow of lethal violence, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his broadsword, his crimson eyes daring anyone in the room to breathe incorrectly. Sylvester reached the center of the chamber. He looked up at the emperor. Every noble in the room held their breath, waiting for the customary genuflection, waiting for Sylvester to fall to his knees and press his forehead to the marble. Sylvester didn't even bow his head. He simply nodded, a polite but firm acknowledgement between 2 CEOs. Treason! York shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Sylvester. He refuses to kneel before the son of Astrea. Guards, strike him down. None of the guards moved. Cassian had merely shifted his weight, and the royal knights instantly decided their wages weren't high enough to test the crown prince's blade. Emperor Aurelius, Sylvester spoke, his baritone voice smooth, carrying effortlessly to the highest tiers of the chamber. I apologize for my tardiness. I was busy balancing a deficit that these gentlemen spent the last 10 years creating. Sylvester von Ravenwood, the emperor rasped, his eyes narrowing at the boy who dared stand tall before him. The High Council has formally accused you of overreach. They claim your tariffs will bankrupt the noble houses. They threaten to withdraw their private mercenary armies from the eastern borders unless you are removed. The emperor leaned forward, his aura heavy. Give me one reason why I shouldn't hand you over to them to preserve the peace of my empire. Sylvester didn't flinch. He smiled. It was a cold, razor-edged smile that made the Duke of York's blood run cold. Because, Your Majesty, Sylvester said, pulling a thick stack of folded contracts from his coat pocket and tossing them onto the marble floor at the Duke of York's feet. They don't have any armies to withdraw. York stared at the papers. He slowly bent down, picking one up, his face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. What is this? York stammered. That is a buyout clause, Sylvester explained casually, clasping his hands behind his back. Yesterday evening, I authorized a dispersal of funds from the newly recovered War Ministry accounts. I sent riders to every mercenary captain stationed on the eastern border. Sylvester's eyes locked onto York, pinning the man like a bug to a board. Our mercenaries 8 silver pieces a week, York, and you were routinely 2 months late on payments. I offered them 12 silver a week, guaranteed by the Imperial Treasury, provided they sign an exclusive loyalty oath to the crown. Sylvester turned slowly, addressing the entire shocked council. As of midnight last night, every single private mercenary company in the Eastern Quadrant belongs to me. You are officially toothless. Pandemonium erupted. Nobles shouted, cursed, and threatened, but it was hollow. Without their private armies, they were just old men in expensive velvet. Silence! The emperor roared, his voice echoing with ancient authority. The room quieted instantly. The emperor looked at Sylvester, a mixture of shock and profound calculation in his aging eyes. You bought an army? Without my permission? I consolidated a fractured corporate asset to prevent a hostile strike, Sylvester corrected smoothly, entirely unfazed by the emperor's anger. I secured your borders, centralized your military power under the crown prince, and stripped your internal enemies of their fangs. And it didn't cost the crown a single copper of its own money. I used the funds Duke Valerius embezzled. Sylvester took a step forward, his dominance absolute. I don't bow, Your Majesty, because I am not your servant. I am your salvation. The Duke of York and his coalition will now pay their luxury tariffs in full by the end of the week, or I will send my newly acquired mercenaries to repossess their estates. The emperor stared at the young man. For 20 years, Aurelius had fought to strip the nobles of their military power and failed. This 22-year-old upstart had done it in a single evening, armed with nothing but ledgers and ruthless audacity. Behind Sylvester, Cassian let out a soft, dark, utterly captivated laugh. Well, Lord York, the emperor finally said, leaning back on his throne, a grim smile touching his lips. It appears your petition is denied. Pay your taxes. Sylvester didn't gloat. He simply turned on his heel, his coat flaring behind him, and walked back down the aisle. The nobles parted for him like frightened sheep avoiding a wolf. Cassian fell into step beside him, his crimson eyes burning with an intense, possessive pride. As they exited the heavy oak doors, leaving the stunned council behind, Cassian leaned down. You are a menace, Sylvester, Cassian whispered, his voice thick with raw approval. I'm a pragmatist, Sylvester corrected, checking his silver pocket watch. Now, come along, Cassian. I have a meeting with the Iron Guild in 20 minutes, and I require you to look exceptionally intimidating while I cut their profit margins in half. Chapter 8. The Price of Blood and Iron. The Iron Guild was the beating, industrial heart of the Istrian Empire. Located in the lower river district, the guild hall was a colossal structure of iron girders, black soot, and roaring blast furnaces. It was where raw or became broadswords, and where 5 grandmasters dictated the cost of warfare across the continent. Grandmaster Vane, a giant of a man with scarred hands and a beard woven with iron rings, sat at the head of a heavy ironwood table. Surrounding him were the 4 regional guild directors. "The young Ravenwood boy thinks he can dictate terms to us?" Vane barked, tossing a parchment onto the iron table. "Because he caught a foolish duke stealing pennies? The war ministry eats our steel, or it starves. He cut our profit margin by 30% in the new contract draft." Another director muttered nervously. "And he's already seized the Eastern mercenary contracts. Mercenaries are flesh. Steel is absolute." Vane roared, slamming his leather-bound fist down. "If Sylvester von Ravenwood wants our iron, he pays our price, or we shut down every blast furnace from here to the coast. Let us see how long his precious treasury lasts when the Crown Prince has no swords for his army." The heavy iron doors at the end of the hall groaned open, screeching against the stone floor. Sylvester stepped through the smoke and heat of the forge hall. He wore an immaculate double-breasted coat of charcoal wool, dark gloves, and polished boots that didn't show a single speck of the soot clinging to the air. Beside him walked Crown Prince Cassian, towering, silent, his obsidian-hilted broadsword resting casually against his hip, his crimson eyes gleaming like hot coals through the haze. Sylvester didn't wait to be greeted. He walked directly to the head of the table, pulling out the grand iron chair opposite Vane and sitting down with smooth, arrogant composure. "Gentlemen," Sylvester said, his voice crisp and clear, cutting effortlessly through the distant thud of forge hammers. "I trust you've read my revised contract." Vane sneered, leaning over the table, his massive frame attempting to intimidate the slender man sitting before him. "We read it, Ravenwood, and we reject it. The Iron Guild does not take orders from a court fop who has never held a hammer in his life. You will pay our standard rate, or the furnaces go cold before nightfall." Sylvester tilted his head, resting his chin on his gloved hand. He looked at Vane not with anger, but with the cold, detached interest of a scientist looking at a slightly dull specimen. "A strike," Sylvester drawled smoothly. "How terribly predictable. You believe you hold a monopoly on the Empire's weapon supply, Grandmaster Vane. You believe that because you control the furnaces, you control the war. We do control it," Vane spat. "Without us, Astria falls." "No," Sylvester corrected, reaching into his coat and pulling out a small, heavy black stone. He tossed it casually onto the center of the table. It rolled with a sharp metallic clatter, stopping right in front of Vane. "Without you, Astria simply imports high-grade blast-refined steel from the southern dwarven cartels at 16% lower cost than your guild charges." Vane froze, his eyes locked onto the black stone, a piece of dense, flawlessly refined dwarven steel. "The dwarven cartels haven't traded with Astria in 30 years, the second director blurted out, pale with sudden panic. "The imperial tariffs made it impossible." "The imperial tariffs I restructured 3 days ago," Sylvester said, a thin, razor-like smile spreading across his lips. "I signed a treaty with the Southern Dwarven ambassadors this morning. In exchange for exclusive salt rights, which I secured after breaking the Northern Barbarians, they have agreed to flood our ports with 5,000 tons of refined steel per month." Sylvester leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his icy blue eyes fixing Vane in a terrifying, hypnotic grip. "Your blast furnaces are obsolete, Vane. Your iron ore is full of sulfur, your refining process is 50 years behind schedule, and your operating costs are astronomical. If you shut down your furnaces tonight, I won't beg you to reopen them. I will bankrupt your guild, seize your facilities under Imperial eminent domain, and replace your directors with dwarven engineers." The room went completely, suffocatingly quiet. The distant thud of the forge hammers sounded like a dying pulse. Vane was breathing heavily, his scarred face turning a deep, dangerous purple. His hand twitched toward a heavy iron mallet resting near his ledger. "You bastard!" Vane growled, his voice trembling with murderous rage. "You ruined us before you even stepped through the door." Vane lunged across the table, grabbing the iron mallet and swinging it straight toward Sylvester's head. Sylvester didn't even blink. He didn't flinch. He didn't even move his head. Clang! A deafening ring of steel on steel echoed through the hall. Cassian's broadsword was out. The black blade was held vertically, blocking the massive iron mallet effortlessly with one hand. The sheer impact sent a shockwave through the air, but Cassian's arm didn't shake an inch. Cassian stood slightly behind Sylvester's chair, his crimson eyes glowing with an insane, bloodthirsty excitement. A terrifying smile carved across the prince's face as he looked down at Vane. "Touch him," Cassian whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, suffocating murder that made every director in the room drop to their knees in terror. "And I will feed your flesh to your own blast furnaces, Vane." Cassian twisted his wrist, flicking his sword. The sheer force snapped the heavy wooden handle of Vane's mallet like a toothpick, sending the iron head crashing harmlessly to the stone floor. Sylvester slowly reached up, his gloved fingers catching the flat of Cassian's blade, gently pushing the deadly sword down. "Easy, Cassian," Sylvester murmured, his tone as casual as if he were managing an unruly guard dog. "We need his signature before you execute him." Cassian let out a raspy, dark exhale, shearing his blade back into its scabbard with a sharp click, though his smoldering eyes remained fixed on Vane like an apex predator evaluating prey. Sylvester slid the revised contract across the ironwood table, along with a silver quill dipped in fresh black ink. 30% price reduction on all military steel, Sylvester commanded, his baritone voice leaving zero room for negotiation. 10% yield royalty paid directly to the Imperial Treasury. You sign, Vane, or you die a pauper in the Imperial dungeons before sunset. Vane, sweating profusely, his hands trembling violently, looked from the deadly crown prince to the terrifying, cold mastermind sitting before him. He realized, with absolute clarity, that Sylvester von Ravenwood was far more dangerous than any dragon or army the Empire had ever faced. Vane picked up the quill with shaking fingers and signed his name at the bottom of the parchment. Sylvester took the scroll, blowing gently on the wet ink before folding it neatly into his inner pocket. He stood up, adjusting his dark lapels, entirely unruffled by the violence that had just almost occurred. "Pleasure doing business with you, gentlemen," Sylvester said, turning his back on the broken guildmasters and walking toward the grand exit. Cassian fell into step beside him, matching Sylvester's arrogant, measured stride. As they stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, away from the heat and soot, Cassian leaned down, his broad shoulder brushing against Sylvester's. "You knew he was going to swing that hammer," Cassian said, his voice dripping with dark amusement. "Of course I did," Sylvester replied smoothly, pulling off his gloves to inspect his pristine fingernails. "Desperate men always resort to physical violence when their financial leverage collapses." "And you hoped I would stop it?" Cassian added, his crimson eyes locking onto Sylvester's side profile with intense, smoldering heat. Sylvester stopped walking. He turned, looking up at the crown prince, a slow, dominant smirk curving his lips as he reached out, fixing the gold pin on Cassian's velvet cloak. "I didn't hope you would stop it, Cassian," Sylvester whispered, his icy blue eyes sparkling with absolute, dangerous authority. "I knew you would. A good weapon always obeys its wielder." Cassian's breath hitched, a hot, intoxicating thrill slamming through his chest as Sylvester turned and walked ahead, leaving the crown prince of the realm standing in the sunlight, completely enraptured by the only man who dared to call him a weapon. Chapter 9. The Anatomy of a Fall. The rain had returned by late evening, washing over the black slate roofs of the Ravenwood Manor. In the private sanctuary of Sylvester's study, the fire crackled against dark stone walls. Ledgers, map cylinders, and foreign trade treaties lay neatly organized across the sprawling oak table. Sylvester sat back in his velvet armchair, a glass of dark amber whiskey resting in his hand, his coat discarded, leaving him in a crisp black silk shirt with the top 3 buttons casually undone. Standing by the window, staring out into the storm, was Cassian. The crown prince was silent, an oppressive, brooding storm of physical power. For 3 days since the incident at the Iron Guild, Cassian had been tormented by a strange, suffocating sensation in his chest. He was the bloodthirsty tyrant of the Istrian Empire. Men feared him. Women swooned at his feet. Kings bowed to his blade. Yet, when Sylvester had looked him in the eyes and called him his weapon, Cassian hadn't felt insult or rage. He had felt an electric, terrifying surge of absolute surrender. "You're pacing again, Cassian," Sylvester said smoothly, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "If you're here to brood over the Iron Guild's yield reports, save it for tomorrow's briefing." Cassian turned around. His crimson eyes were dark, glowing like dying embers in the dim firelight. He walked toward the desk with slow, heavy strides, the sheer weight of his presence filling every inch of the room. "I don't care about the iron yield, Sylvester," Cassian rasped, his voice dropping into a guttural, dangerous register. "Then why are you in my study at midnight?" Sylvester asked, setting his glass down with a soft, metallic click. He looked up, his icy blue eyes completely unbothered, his posture oozing effortless dominance. "Because you're driving me insane," Cassian growled. Before Sylvester could reply, Cassian closed the distance, his broad, calloused hands slamming down onto the arms of Sylvester's velvet chair, trapping him completely. Cassian leaned down, his face mere inches from Sylvester's, his hot, ragged breath brushing against Sylvester's lips. "You look at me like I'm an asset on a ledger," Cassian hissed softly, his crimson eyes searching Sylvester's face for even a sliver of emotion, finding only cool, razor-sharp intellect. "You use me to threaten dukes, you use me to break guild masters, and then you turn around and tell me to put my clothes on." Sylvester didn't flinch. He slowly leaned forward, his nose brushing against Cassian's jawline, his lips curving into a mocking, intoxicating smirk. "Is the big, bad crown prince upset because he isn't being flattered?" Sylvester whispered, his voice smooth as liquid silk. He reached up, his long fingers casually tangling into Cassian's long silver hair, tugging just hard enough to force the prince to look him directly in the eyes. "I don't flatter people, Cassian. I use competent tools. If you want sweet words and mindless worship, go back to your court of sheep." Cassian let out a low, breathless groan. The absolute arrogance of the man, the sheer, unyielding refusal to bow even when pinned beneath an apex predator, shattered the last remnants of Cassian's self-control. "You arrogant, magnificent bastard," Cassian growled, and brought his mouth down on Sylvester's in a bruising, possessive kiss. It was a clash of absolute forces. Cassian kissed him like a starving man, his tongue invading, his grip tightening on Sylvester's hair. Sylvester met him with equal ferocity, his hands gripping Cassian's broad shoulders, his teeth nipping sharp against Cassian's lip until the taste of metallic iron bloomed between them. With a heavy groan, Cassian hauled Sylvester out of the chair, sweeping the books and maps off the couch in a single violent motion, crashing them both onto the soft velvet cushions. Sylvester's black silk shirt was yanked open, buttons popping and rolling across the floor as Cassian's hot mouth tracked down Sylvester's throat, leaving deep red bite marks along his collarbone. Sylvester gasped, his fingers digging into the hard muscle of Cassian's back, pulling the heavier man down, arching into the searing heat. "Say it again," Cassian rasped against Sylvester's skin, his hands gripping Sylvester's hips with enough force to leave dark bruises tomorrow. "Call me your weapon." "You are my weapon, Cassian," Sylvester hissed, his voice thick with ragged heat, his long legs wrapping tightly around the prince's waist, pulling him in with zero hesitation. "Now use it." When they joined, it was raw, heavy, and completely devoid of softness. Cassian drove into him with a ruthless, desperate rhythm, seeking to break Sylvester's composure, seeking to hear him scream. But Sylvester refused to be broken. Sylvester threw his head back against the velvet cushions, his chest heaving, his blue eyes flashing open to lock onto Cassian's crimson gaze through every hard, shattering thrust. Sylvester met every drive, his hips rising to match the brutal cadence, his hands clawing down Cassian's scarred back, taking control of the rhythm, dictating the height of their friction until Cassian was completely at his mercy. The heat in the room spiraled out of control. Sweating, gasping, their breath mingling in harsh, desperate pants, they pushed each other to the absolute edge of physical endurance. When the climax slammed into them, Cassian buried his face in the crook of Sylvester's neck, a guttural, shattered groan escaping his chest as he poured himself into the man beneath him, his entire massive frame trembling with the intensity of it. Sylvester arched violently, his knuckles turning white as he held onto Cassian's shoulders, riding the blinding peak with a sharp, breathless gasp of pure triumph. Silence fell over the room, save for the rain and the sound of their heavy, synchronized breathing. Cassian lay heavily on top of him, his head resting on Sylvester's chest, feeling the steady, strong rhythm of Sylvester's heart beneath his cheek. And in that quiet, sweat-slicked moment, the realization hit Cassian like a physical blow. He looked up at Sylvester. He saw the faint red marks on his pale skin, the dark, messy hair, and those icy blue eyes looking up at the ceiling, already distant, already calculating his next move. Gods above, Cassian thought, his chest tightening with a profound, terrifying ache. I'm in love with him. It wasn't a sudden spark. It was a total, irreversible collapse of his defenses. The Crown Prince of Estria, a man built for war, blood, and tyranny, had fallen hopelessly, desperately, helplessly in love with a man who viewed him as a strategic business partner. Cassian wanted to build him a throne out of gold. He wanted to tear down the world just to see Sylvester smile. He wanted Sylvester's heart. Cassian reached up, his calloused fingers trembling slightly as he gently brushed a stray lock of dark hair from Sylvester's forehead. His crimson eyes softened, filled with a raw, painful warmth he had never felt in his entire life. Sylvester, Cassian whispered, his voice dangerously soft, vulnerable for the first time. Sylvester blinked, his icy gaze shifting down to meet Cassian's. He saw the look in the prince's eyes, the raw devotion, the soft, domestic weight of a man who had surrendered his heart. Sylvester didn't flinch. He didn't blush. He didn't offer a sweet smile. Instead, Sylvester raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into his signature, razor-sharp smirk. He reached out and casually patted Cassian's cheek twice, exactly as one would praise a loyal, high-performing officer. "Good work tonight, Your Highness," Sylvester said smoothly, his tone as cool and professional as a corporate morning memo. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, casually nudging Cassian off him. "Now get up. The Southern Customs report arrives in 3 hours, and you need to look like an intimidating regent, not a lingering mistress." Cassian sat up on the edge of the couch, watching Sylvester stand, pick up his discarded trousers, and casually button his clothes without a single drop of romantic sentiment. Cassian let out a raspy, painful laugh, rubbing his face with his hands. He was utterly, completely ruined. Sylvester hadn't changed an inch. He was still the same cold, brilliant, arrogant sovereign of his own destiny. And as Cassian watched Sylvester walk over to his desk to review a fresh stack of trade papers, the Crown Prince realized with absolute terror and thrill. He was going to spend the rest of his life chasing a man who would only ever bow to his own ambition. Chapter 10. The Sovereign's Masterpiece. The morning sun broke over the capital, painting the white marble towers of the imperial palace in brilliant shades of amber and gold. But inside the grand imperial hall, the atmosphere was colder than a grave. Today was the anniversary of the emperor's ascension, a day when foreign envoys, grand dukes, and high ministers gathered to present their tributes and petition the throne. Emperor Aurelius sat high on the golden dragon throne, his face impassive under his heavy crown. To his right stood Crown Prince Cassian, arrayed in majestic black and gold ceremonial armor, a sweeping crimson velvet cape draped over his shoulders. Cassian stood like a god of war, but his crimson eyes were fixed on only one person in the grand hall. Standing at the head of the high ministers, a position traditionally reserved for the prime minister, was Sylvester. Sylvester wore a tailored coat of midnight blue silk, embroidered with silver thread that shimmered like stars. A pristine white cravat sat tucked at his throat, and a silver-tipped walking cane rested lightly against his polished leather boot. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need one. He looked down his nose at the surrounding foreign ambassadors with a cool, aristocratic detachment that made every monarch in the room feel like an uninvited guest. Presenting the envoy of the high elven kingdom of Sylvester, the imperial herald shouted, his voice echoing through the vast stone arches. An arched elf in shimmering silver robes stepped forward, accompanied by 2 guards carrying a heavy velvet-lined chest. The envoy bowed deeply to the emperor, then straightened his spine with an unmistakable air of ancient superiority. Your Imperial Majesty, the elven envoy declared, his voice ringing with melodic arrogance. In honor of your ascension, the High King offers 300 weight of raw star silk and the exclusive rights to the Western Mana Mines for the next 5 years. The court gasped softly. Star silk was worth its weight in diamonds, and the Western Mana Mines were a legendary power source. In return, the envoy continued, his eyes darting briefly toward Sylvester with a smirk of clear condescension. Sylvester requests the immediate dissolution of the new Austrian customs tariff, which unfairly burdens our merchant fleets. Surely, a grand empire does not need to nickel and dime its ancient allies. A ripple of quiet murmurs swept through the foreign diplomats. They had pooled their political capital to back the elven envoy, hoping to force the emperor to break Sylvester's relentless economic chokehold on foreign trade. Emperor Aurelius turned his head slightly toward Sylvester. Lord Treasurer, how stands the crown's response to Sylvester's generous offer? Sylvester didn't move. He didn't bow to the emperor, nor did he look at the elven envoy. He simply rested both hands on the silver head of his walking cane, his voice smooth, clear, and carrying the terrifying weight of absolute authority. The offer is rejected, Sylvester said flatly. The entire hall froze. The elven envoy went stiff, his ears twitching in outrage. Rejected? You dare spurn the gift of the High King, boy? I spurn trash dressed as a gift, Sylvester replied, taking a single, measured step forward. His icy blue eyes locked onto the envoy with the cold, calculating precision of an executioner examining a neck. First, Sylvester said, holding up a slender gloved finger, 300 weight of star silk is an artificial surplus. Sylvester produced 4,000 weight this season due to mild weather. You are dumping low-grade stock into our capital to depress local textile prices and bankrupt our domestic weavers. The envoy swallowed hard, his arrogant smirk beginning to falter. Second, Sylvester continued smoothly, holding up a second finger. The Western Mana Mines are 60% depleted. You aren't offering us a resource, envoy. You are offering us an environmental liability that will cost the Austrian treasury 200,000 gold to properly decommission when the veins run dry next spring. Sylvester took another step closer, his midnight blue coat flaring slightly. And as for your complaints regarding my customs tariff, as of 6 o'clock this morning, I signed a strategic trade alliance with the Dwarven Iron Cartels and the free ports of Oakhaven. Astria no longer requires Sylvester's trade routes. If your merchant fleets refuse to pay my 12% tariff, Sylvester offered the envoy a cold, blindingly beautiful, and utterly ruthless smile. You are welcome to rot in your harbors. We don't need your silk, and we certainly don't need your permission. Silence fell over the great hall, a heavy, suffocating silence. The elven envoy stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. The foreign diplomats behind him backed away slowly, horrified by the utter speed with which the young human treasurer had disassembled the grandest kingdom on the continent without raising a sword. You monster, the envoy whispered, his pride completely shattered. You've cornered the entire Western market. I didn't corner it, Sylvester corrected softly, stepping back to his position at the head of the ministers. I bought it. Now, take your spoiled silk and get out of my court. The envoy practically fled the hall, his guards scrambling to pick up the heavy chest as the surrounding Austrian nobles burst into quiet, awestruck murmurs. High on the dais, Emperor Aurelius let out a slow, heavy breath, leaning back in his throne. He looked at Sylvester not with anger for his lack of decorum, but with a profound, terrifying realization. Austria wasn't just safe. It had become an unstoppable, global economic empire, guided by the ruthless genius of a single young man who bowed to no one. Beside the throne, Cassian's heart was hammering against his ribs like a siege engine. The crown prince stared down at Sylvester. He watched the way Sylvester adjusted his white cravat, the way his icy blue eyes swept over the humbled court with supreme, unbothered arrogance. Cassian's chest burned with a love so fierce, so absolute, it bordered on madness. This was the man Cassian had sworn to protect. But Sylvester didn't need a sword or a shield. Sylvester was a sovereign in his own right, a god of coin, chains, and strategy who had turned an empire into his personal chessboard. Cassian stepped down from the dais, his heavy armor clanking against the marble floor as he walked straight towards Sylvester. The court went dead silent, watching the terrifying prince approach the treasurer. Cassian stopped inches from Sylvester. He didn't draw a blade. He didn't offer a royal command. Before the eyes of 50 foreign envoys, the emperor, and the entire nobility of Austria, the bloodthirsty crown prince slowly reached out. His thick, calloused fingers caught Sylvester's hand, lifting it gently. Cassian bowed his silver head, pressing a firm, desperate, and utterly reverent kiss to the back of Sylvester's gloved knuckles. "My lord treasurer," Cassian murmured, his crimson eyes looking up at Sylvester with unreserved, helpless devotion. "The empire is yours, and so am I." A collective gasp echoed through the court. The crown prince, the tyrant of Austria, had just publicly offered his loyalty, his heart, and his sword to the duke's son. Sylvester didn't blush. He didn't pull his hand away. He simply looked down at the future emperor kneeling slightly before him, a lazy, dominant, and victorious smirk curving his lips. Sylvester tapped Cassian's shoulder casually with the silver tip of his walking cane, as if knighted a loyal servant. "Stand up, Cassian," Sylvester said smoothly, his baritone voice echoing in the silent hall for all to hear. "We have a continent to buy." Chapter 11. The Currency of Jealousy. The southern seas were famous for two things: vibrant indigo dye and ruthless merchant princes. Sitting across from Sylvester in the glass-domed conservatory of the imperial palace was Lord Vaylor, the younger brother of the sovereign Grand Duke of Oakhaven. Vaylor was strikingly handsome, possessing sun-bronzed skin, golden eyes, and a charming, liquid gold smile that had won him trade concessions from 3 different kingdoms. "You are a marvel, Lord Sylvester," Vaylor purred, leaning forward across the marble table. His silk shirt was casually unbuttoned at the neck, showcasing a heavy gold chain set with raw sapphires. He reached out, his fingers hovering dangerously close to Sylvester's sleeve. "I came to the capital expecting an old, withered bureaucrat. Instead, I find a sovereign mastermind with the face of an angel and the mind of a conqueror." Sylvester didn't pull back, nor did he look flustered. He simply took a slow sip of his jasmine tea, his icy blue eyes assessing Vaylor like a piece of high-yielding real estate. "Flattery yields 0% dividend on import duties, Lord Vaylor," Sylvester replied dryly, setting his teacup down with a soft clink. "Though I appreciate the effort. Now, regarding the Oakhaven shipping lane tariff." "Forget the tariff for a moment, Sylvester," Vaylor interrupted smoothly, his golden eyes sparkling with bold flirtation. He lowered his voice, tilting his head. "A man of your supreme intellect is wasted in this dreary, war-obsessed capital. Come to Oakhaven with me. I will give you 3 grand fleets, a palace overlooking the sea, and a seat at my right hand. We could rule the southern trade together." Vaylor reached out and gently laid his hand directly over Sylvester's on the table. Sylvester raised an eyebrow, about to dismantle Vaylor's pitch with a brutal financial breakdown, when the air in the conservatory suddenly turned sub-zero. The heavy glass doors slammed open so hard a pane fractured. Crown Prince Cassian stepped into the conservatory. He wasn't wearing his formal robes or his golden armor. He was clad in black leather combat gear, freshly returned from training the Imperial Guard. His hair was wind-blown, sweat glistened on his sharp jawline, and his crimson eyes were burning with a terrifying, unadulterated madness. The absolute, suffocating pressure of Cassian's bloodlust exploded into the room like a physical wave. The delicate exotic flowers in the conservatory seemed to wither under the heat of his aura. Cassian's gaze landed instantly on Vaylor's hand resting on top of Sylvester's. In a fraction of a second, Cassian crossed the marble floor. Before Vaylor could even register the movement, Cassian's calloused hand shot out like an iron vice, grabbing Vaylor by the throat and lifting the full-grown merchant prince 2 feet into the air. Crash! Cassian slammed Vaylor against the heavy stone pillar behind the table, his broadsword clearing its scabbard by 2 inches with a lethal metallic hiss. "Take your hand off him!" Cassian snarled, his voice a guttural, demonic growl that vibrated through the stone floor. His crimson eyes were bloodshot, completely consumed by a feral, insane jealousy. "Touch him again, and I will tear Oak Haven off the map, chop your body into 50 pieces, and feed you to the southern sharks." Vaylor gasped, his face turning purple, his hands clawing uselessly at Cassian's iron grip. "Prince, Cassian, Cassian, drop him." The voice was not loud. It was smooth, calm, and utterly absolute. Cassian didn't look away from Vaylor, his grip tightening. "He touched you, Sylvester. He dared to offer you." "Cassian?" Sylvester repeated, standing up from his chair with fluid, unhurried grace. He walked over, stopping right beside the towering prince. Sylvester raised his hand, his slender fingers resting flat against the side of Cassian's tense, burning neck. "I said, drop him. You are ruining my trade negotiation." The moment Sylvester's cool skin touched Cassian's neck, the prince's violent aura flickered. Cassian's breathing was heavy, ragged, his chest heaving as he slowly shifted his crimson eyes to look at Sylvester. He looked like a mad dog fighting against its own chain. Desperate, possessive, and helplessly consumed by the thought of losing the only man he worshipped. Slowly, reluctantly, Cassian unclasped his fingers. Vaylor collapsed to the marble floor, coughing violently, clutching his bruised throat in absolute terror. He scrambled backward, looking at the crown prince as if he were a demon summoned from the abyss. "Get out, Vaylor," Sylvester said, not even looking at the merchant prince. "The Oak Haven Treaty is accepted at the 6% rate. My scribes will send the papers. Leave us." Vaylor didn't wait to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted out of the conservatory like a man fleeing a burning building. Silence returned to the glass dome, save for the sound of Cassian's heavy, ragged breathing. The prince stood pinned against the pillar, his broadsword half-drawn, his hands trembling with residual wild rage. "You let him touch you," Cassian rasped, his voice thick with a painful, desperate ache. He turned his face into Sylvester's palm, pressing his cheek against Sylvester's skin, his eyes wide and burning. "You let him offer you fleets. You let him talk to you like you could leave." Sylvester looked at the towering tyrant before him. In his previous life and in every contract he had ever negotiated, people were disposable assets. Affection was a weakness to be exploited. Love was a liability. But looking at Cassian, this bloodthirsty, unstoppable monster of a prince who stood trembling simply because another man had touched Sylvester's hand, something subtle shifted deep within Sylvester's calculated mind. Cassian wasn't just a useful weapon. He was his weapon, a wild, terrifying, utterly devoted force of nature that existed solely to burn the world for him. A faint, genuinely warm spark flickered in Sylvester's icy blue eyes, a rare, genuine crack in his impenetrable armor. Sylvester didn't pull his hand away. Instead, he stepped closer, closing the distance between them until his chest touched Cassian's leather armor. He reached up with his other hand, taking Cassian by his sharp jawline, forcing the crown prince to look down into his eyes. "Listen to me, you foolish brute," Sylvester said softly, his baritone voice lacking its usual cold, corporate edge. It was smooth, intimate, and possessive. "Valor offered me 3 fleets and a palace." Cassian's jaw clenched, a low growl rising in his throat. "And do you know what I thought?" Sylvester continued, his thumb gently stroking the stubble along Cassian's jawline. "I thought his offer was pathetically small, because I already have the greatest army on the continent. I already have the crown prince of Astria wrapped around my finger." Cassian froze, his breath catching in his throat. His crimson eyes searched Sylvester's face, stunned. "Nobody buys me, Cassian?" Sylvester murmured, leaning up slightly until his lips brushed against Cassian's ear, making the massive prince shudder. "And nobody takes me away from what is mine. This empire is mine. The treasury is mine." Sylvester pulled back slightly, looking straight into Cassian's smoldering eyes, a sharp, incredibly alluring, and surprisingly tender smirk gracing his lips. "And you are mine." Cassian let out a ragged, breathless gasp. The wild, insane jealousy in his chest instantly melted, replaced by a wave of intoxicating, ecstatic relief so intense it almost brought the tyrant to his knees. Cassian slammed his broadsword back into its sheath and wrapped his heavy, muscular arms around Sylvester's waist, pulling Sylvester flush against his body. He buried his face in the crook of Sylvester's neck, breathing in his scent, holding him with a fierce, protective grip. "Say it again," Cassian rasped, his voice muffled against Sylvester's skin. "Say you're mine." Sylvester let out a low, soft chuckle. Not a mocking laugh, but a smooth, satisfied sound. For the first time, Sylvester raised his own arms voluntarily, wrapping them around Cassian's broad shoulders and running his fingers through the prince's silver hair. "Don't push your luck, your highness," Sylvester murmured softly against Cassian's hair, though he didn't pull away. He leaned into the embrace, resting his chin on Cassian's shoulder. "I gave you your quota of sweet sentiment for the month." Cassian pulled back just enough to look at Sylvester, a breathtaking, radiant smile breaking across the prince's scarred face. A smile no one in the Empire had ever seen before. Cassian leaned down, pressing a desperate, deeply tender kiss to Sylvester's lips. This time, Sylvester didn't fight for control, nor did he treat it like a transaction. He leaned into the kiss, meeting Cassian's warmth with a smooth, lingering warmth of his own, cementing his hold over the crown prince's heart forever. When they finally parted, Sylvester adjusted his cuffs, his usual arrogant, dominant expression returning, though his eyes remained remarkably soft as he looked up at the prince. "Now, clean up your mess, Cassian," Sylvester smirked, tapping the prince's chest. "You broke my conservatory glass, and I am charging the repair bill directly to your personal allowance." Chapter 12. Rewards and Absolute Ruin. The imperial treasury was usually a tomb of solemn whispers and scratchy quills. Today, however, it smelled faintly of fresh lavender and expensive ink. Sylvester sat behind his grand desk of carved obsidian, a silver magnifying glass in hand as he cross-referenced the quarterly tax yields from the southern provinces. Beside him stood Master Scribe Oates, a thin, balding man in his late 50s who had spent 30 years being ignored and underpaid by corrupt war ministers. Standing nervously behind Oates was Clara, a young junior archivist in a faded blue uniform whose ink-stained fingers twitched against her apron. "My Lord Treasurer," Oates squeaked, holding a ledger with trembling hands. "The audit of the Grand Duke of Vane's shipping accounts. We found it just as you suspected. He was running a shadow fleet through the Western Isthmus, hiding 3,000 tons of raw gold or under the guise of salt exports." Sylvester set the magnifying glass down with a slow, deliberate click. He leaned back, crossing his dark velvet-clad legs, his icy blue eyes fixing the pair in a cool, calculating gaze. "You found it, Oates?" Sylvester asked, his voice a smooth, elegant baritone. "Or did the girl behind you find it?" Oates went pale, sweating instantly. Clara gasped softly, dropping her head. I review the filing times, Oates. Sylvester drawled smoothly, pointing a slender finger at the ledger. The cross-referencing on page 42 uses a double-entry ledger method I introduced 2 weeks ago. You don't know how to use it yet. She does. Step aside. Oates scrambled out of the way like a terrified toad. Clara stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs as Sylvester looked her up and down. Your name? Sylvester commanded softly. Clara, my lord, she stuttered. I stayed in the lower archives for 3 nights matching the harbor timestamps. Sylvester pulled a small iron key from his waistcoat pocket and unlocked the top drawer of his desk. He reached in and pulled out a velvet pouch, dropping it onto the dark obsidian table with a heavy, metallic clink. Inside is 200 gold sovereigns, Sylvester said flatly, along with a deed to a 3-story townhome in the upper district and a draft appointing you head imperial auditor, effectively making you Oates' boss. Oates choked on his own breath. Clara froze, her jaw dropping, her eyes going wide as saucer plates. My lord, 200. I'm just a junior archivist. You are a competent strategist who pays attention to detail. Sylvester interrupted, holding up a hand to cut off her sputtering. His tone was firm, sharp, yet devoid of hostility. I don't reward age or titles, Clara. Incompetence receives an execution warrant. Excellence receives capital allocation. You saved this treasury 200,000 gold pieces with your diligence. The house is yours. The title is yours. Sylvester's eyes narrowed into a razor-thin, cold glint that made the hair on the back of Clara's neck stand up. However, Sylvester added, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. If you ever take a bribe from a duke or misplace a single copper piece, I won't send you to the dungeons. I will personally seize every asset your family has owned for 3 generations and leave you begging on the streets. Understood. Clara bowed so low her forehead nearly touched the carpet, clutching the velvet pouch to her chest like a holy relic. I will die for this treasury, my lord. I swear it on my blood. Don't die, Sylvester drawled, picking up his quill again. Just keep double-checking the manifests. Oates, show her to her new office. Dismissed. As a sobbing Oates and an awestruck Clara backed out of the grand chamber, the heavy side door to Sylvester's private rest quarters creaked open. Crown Prince Cassian stepped out. He wore a dark burgundy tunic, unbuttoned at the throat, his silver hair slightly disheveled. He had spent the last 2 hours lounging on Sylvester's private divan, watching Sylvester work through the open door, a sight that brought the ruthless tyrant a quiet, possessive peace he had never known in his violent life. Cassian walked over, leaning his heavy hands on the edge of the obsidian desk, looking down at Sylvester with a soft, smoldering gaze. A house, a promotion, and 200 gold for a junior archivist? Cassian murmured, a faint, amused smile touching his sharp lips. You're getting soft, Sylvester. The old war minister would have stolen her research and thrown her in a cell. I am not soft. I am strategic, Sylvester replied without looking up from his paper. A loyal, highly motivated chief auditor who owes her entire life to me is worth 10 regiments of mercenaries. Pay your people well, Cassian, and promote them on merit. They will betray your enemies before your enemies even figure out how to write a bribe. Cassian let out a low, rumbling laugh. He reached across the desk, his calloused fingers gently catching Sylvester's chin, tilting his head up. Sylvester didn't pull away. He didn't scoff or slap Cassian's hand down as he used to. Instead, he let his icy blue eyes meet Cassian's crimson glare, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth softening the sharp edges of his expression. Cassian leaned down across the heavy desk, pressing a slow, deep kiss to Sylvester's lips. Sylvester leaned into it, his eyelids fluttering closed for a brief moment as he allowed himself to taste the dark wine and heat on the prince's lips, his own hand rising to rest gently against Cassian's wrist. When they parted, Cassian stroked Sylvester's cheekbone with his thumb, his crimson eyes filled with an intense, unreserved devotion. The Grand Duke of Vane arrives in the capital tonight, Cassian whispered, his voice dark with a promise of violence. He thinks he's attending a winter gala. Shall I take 3 regiments and raise his estate before he reaches the city gates? Sylvester smirked, a sharp, breathtakingly arrogant expression that made Cassian's heart slam against his ribs. No, Sylvester murmured, standing up from his desk and smoothing the front of his midnight coat. He reached out, his hand sliding up Cassian's broad chest to fix the collar of the prince's burgundy tunic, his long fingers lingering against Cassian's collarbone in a rare, deliberate act of affection. Let him come to the gala, Sylvester said, his voice dripping with smooth, dominant malice. Let him wear his finest silks and drink my Valencian wine. And then, right before the 3rd toast, Sylvester looked up into Cassian's eyes, a cold, brilliant spark of absolute power flashing in his blue gaze. I will read Clara's audit report in front of the entire High Court, strip his title, and execute his financial empire before he even finishes his dessert. Cassian stared at him, a raspy, utterly intoxicated breath escaping his throat. He wrapped an arm around Sylvester's waist, pulling him close for one more hard, possessive kiss. Gods! Cassian rasped against Sylvester's mouth, a terrifyingly proud smile on his face. I love the way your mind works. I know, Sylvester smirked, tapping the crown prince's chest with 2 crisp fingers. Now get dressed, Cassian. You have an execution to witness tonight, and I expect my weapon to look immaculate. Chapter 13. The Velvet Cage of Possession. The Grand Winter Gala was a sea of glittering chandeliers, flowing champagne, and silk gowns. Yet, beneath the sweet music and fake smiles, the ballroom was a minefield. Sylvester stood near the grand marble staircase, looking down at the dancing nobles with a glass of sparkling white wine in hand. He wore a tailored velvet coat of obsidian black, embroidered with silver threads that matched the sharp, cold glint in his blue eyes. Beside him stood Clara, wearing a dignified dark green gown and holding a sealed leather folder, the trap that would destroy the Grand Duke of Vane in precisely 30 minutes. The Duke has taken the bait, my lord, Clara reported in a quiet, confident whisper. He just informed the foreign envoys that his trade routes remain untouched by your tariffs. Let him enjoy his delusion, Sylvester murmured, taking a slow sip. The higher he climbs, the louder his bones will crack when he falls. Before Clara could reply, the music shifted, and the crowd near the grand archway parted with a collective gasp of admiration. Stepping into the ballroom was Princess Genevieve, the visiting royal envoy from the western kingdom of Luceria. She was breathlessly gorgeous, wearing a dress woven of pure liquid silver that clung to her curves, her golden hair tumbling over her shoulders in flawless waves. And walking beside her, offering his arm, was Crown Prince Cassian. Cassian was arrayed in full imperial splendor, black dress armor, gold epaulets, and his sweeping crimson cape. He looked towering, majestic, and lethally handsome. Genevieve leaned close to Cassian, her hand resting delicately on his forearm, her melodious laugh ringing through the silent ballroom as she tilted her head up to whisper something in his ear. Cassian offered a polite, low nod, his expression stoic, though from across the room, it looked dangerously intimate. Rumor has it, a nearby duchess whispered behind her fan, the emperor is considering an alliance with Luceria. Princess Genevieve is said to be the only woman worthy of sitting on the dragon throne beside Prince Cassian. Sylvester's hand tightened around the stem of his crystal glass. A sudden, sharp heat ignited in his chest. A feeling so foreign, so dark, and so violently aggressive that Sylvester almost dropped his wine. He didn't do emotions. He didn't do irrational attachments. He calculated assets, liquidated liabilities, and managed supply chains. Yet, looking at Genevieve's hand resting on Cassian's arm, Sylvester felt a scorching, primal rage that threatened to burn the entire ballroom to the ground. He is my weapon, Sylvester's mind hissed, his icy blue eyes narrowing into razor-sharp slits of absolute, possessive malice. He kneels to me. He belongs at my side. How dare she touch what is mine? Sylvester turned to Clara, his baritone voice dropping into a register so chillingly cold it made the newly appointed head auditor take a step back in fear. "Bring the file," Sylvester commanded. "We are moving the execution up. Now." Sylvester descended the marble staircase, his footfalls measured, elegant, and radiating an oppressive aura of dominant authority that instantly drew every eye in the room away from the royal entry. Cassian felt Sylvester's presence before he saw him. The prince's crimson eyes snapped toward the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs as Sylvester approached. Cassian instantly pulled his arm back, disengaging from Princess Genevieve without a shred of royal polite protocol, his entire focus locking onto Sylvester. Genevieve blinked, startled by Cassian's sudden coldness, and turned to look at the man approaching them. Sylvester didn't look at the princess. He walked straight up to Cassian, stopping mere inches from the crown prince's chest. Sylvester reached out, a move so outrageously bold before the entire high court, and gripped Cassian's collar, yanking the massive prince down until their faces were barely an inch apart. The ballroom gasped in horror. "You're late, Your Highness," Sylvester whispered, his voice low, velvety, and dripping with an unholy, possessive rage that made Cassian's breath hitch. "And you're letting stray dogs lean on your arm." Cassian's crimson eyes went wide. For a second, the crown prince was stunned, and then, as he registered the dark, smoldering fire in Sylvester's blue eyes, a wave of profound, ecstatic realization washed over him. "He's jealous," Cassian thought, his chest expanding with a joy so violent it nearly brought him to his knees. Sylvester is jealous. Instead of pulling away, Cassian let out a raspy, intoxicated breath, his hands instantly coming up to wrap firmly around Sylvester's waist, pulling Sylvester flush against his body in front of the shocked kingdom. "She was delivering a diplomatic letter, Sylvester." Cassian growled softly, a dark, thrilled smile spreading across his sharp face. "I care nothing for her, or Luceria, or her throne. I am yours." Genevieve flushed red with embarrassment and indignation. "Your Highness, who is this insolent?" "Silence," Cassian snapped, his crimson eyes flashing toward Genevieve with a lethal, terrifying glare that made the princess stumble back in fear. "Speak to my treasurer with respect, or leave my empire." Sylvester didn't let go of Cassian's collar. Looking into Cassian's eyes, seeing the absolute, unquestioning devotion in the tyrant's gaze, the last cold barrier around Sylvester's heart shattered. He didn't just view Cassian as an asset anymore. He wanted him. He needed him. He cared for this bloodthirsty brute who would happily slaughter the world just to keep Sylvester satisfied. Sylvester raised his hand, his long fingers gently stroking Cassian's jawline, his expression softening into a rare, breathtakingly intense look of true warmth and absolute possession. "Good," Sylvester murmured, his thumb rubbing over Cassian's lower lip. "Remember that, Cassian, because if I see another hand on your arm tonight, I will liquidate her kingdom before sunrise." Cassian let out a dark, breathless laugh, pressing a fierce, desperate kiss to Sylvester's palm. "Command me, my sovereign." Sylvester turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder at the trembling Grand Duke of Vane, who was trying to slip out the side exit. "Clara," Sylvester said, his voice returning to its sharp, dominant brilliance, though his hand remained wrapped tightly in Cassian's. "Read the audit report. It's time to show this court who truly rules Estria." Chapter 14. The Final Ledger of the Heart. The rain had ceased, leaving the capital wrapped in a heavy, indigo mist. Inside the high spire's private inner sanctum, the only light came from the roaring hearth fire, casting long golden shadows across the stone walls and dark velvet drapes. The door was bolted. The world outside, the high court, the trembling dukes, the foreign envoys, and the entire weight of an empire was locked out. Sylvester stood by the grand mahogany desk, unbuttoning his velvet coat with slow, deliberate movements. He tossed the heavy garment onto a chair, leaving him in his thin white silk shirt. Yet, despite his relaxed state, the electric tension humming through his body was palpable. Standing a few feet away was Cassian. The crown prince had shed his ceremonial armor. He stood broad-shouldered and imposing in a black linen tunic, his silver hair falling loosely over his sharp jawline. His crimson eyes were fixed entirely on Sylvester, smoldering with a mixture of raw hunger, possessive devotion, and the quiet awe of a man who had watched Sylvester command the entire nobility only hours before. "You pushed the Lucerian princess out of the hall without a second thought," Cassian murmured, his deep voice a velvet growl in the quiet room. He took a slow, heavy step forward. The ministers were terrified. They said you looked ready to execute the entire Western delegation. Sylvester didn't look up immediately. He slowly rolled his silk sleeves up his forearms, revealing pale, lean muscle. The Lucerian delegation was attempting to leverage a royal marriage to bypass my harbor tariffs. Sylvester replied, his baritone voice smooth as silk. It was an inefficient strategy. Is that the only reason, Sylvester? Cassian asked softly, closing the distance between them until he was standing directly in Sylvester's space. The heat radiating off the prince was suffocating. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers gently catching Sylvester's jawline. A matter of tariffs? Sylvester went still. He looked up into Cassian's crimson eyes that held no deceit, no political schemes, only an absolute terrifying devotion to him. In his previous life as Alexander Vance, every human interaction was a transaction. Trust was a liability, and affection was a weakness used to destroy you. When he transmigrated into this world, he had vowed to conquer everything so no one could ever put a leash on him again. He had treated Cassian as a weapon, a shield, a powerful asset on an imperial ledger. But as Sylvester looked at the bloodthirsty tyrant standing before him, a man who had publicly bowed his head, who would gladly burn his own empire to ashes if Sylvester asked, the final iron wall around Sylvester's calculated mind completely shattered. Sylvester didn't pull away from Cassian's touch. Instead, he raised his own hand, wrapping his slender fingers firmly around Cassian's wrist. "No," Sylvester whispered. His voice lacked its usual cold, corporate edge. It was low, raspy, and raw with an absolute, unshakable sincerity. "It wasn't just about tariffs." Cassian's breath hitched in his throat. "I don't share my assets, Cassian," Sylvester said, his icy blue eyes locking onto the prince's with a terrifying, breathtaking intensity. "And I certainly don't share the only man in this godforsaken world capable of standing beside me." Sylvester stepped closer, his chest pressing against Cassian's. He reached up, taking Cassian by the nape of his neck, pulling the massive prince down until their foreheads touched. "I love you, Cassian," Sylvester confessed softly into the quiet room. "I love your violence, your loyalty, and the way you look at me like I own your very soul. You are mine, and I am yours." Cassian froze. For a second, the crown prince of Estria looked utterly stunned, his crimson eyes wide, his chest seizing as the words washed over him like a holy revelation. Then, a ragged, breathless gasp escaped Cassian's throat. A fierce, brilliant joy ignited in his eyes, a fire so violent it bordered on madness. "Gods, Sylvester," Cassian rasped, his voice trembling with unadulterated worship. Cassian slammed his mouth down on Sylvester's in a desperate, searing kiss. It was no longer a battle for dominance or a transaction of power. It was a complete, mutual surrender. Sylvester let out a low groan, his arms wrapping tightly around Cassian's broad neck, pulling the prince in with equal, scorching heat, opening his lips and meeting every hard, possessive stroke of Cassian's tongue. With fluid, effortless strength, Cassian lifted Sylvester onto the edge of the heavy oak desk, scattering parchment and trade reports onto the floor without a second thought. Sylvester's silk shirt was yanked open, exposing his pale skin to the warm firelight. Cassian's hot mouth tracked down Sylvester's throat, biting and sucking sharply against his collarbone, making Sylvester arch his back, a ragged, breathless gasp escaping his lips. When Cassian took him tonight, it was entirely different. It was heavy, deep, and intoxicatingly intense. Cassian moved with a slow, agonizingly thorough rhythm that drove Sylvester to the absolute brink of sanity. Every deep, hard thrust was an unspoken vow of eternal captivity. Every rise of Sylvester's hips was an absolute acceptance of the prince's love. Sylvester threw his head back, his knuckles turning white as he gripped Cassian's broad shoulders. His long legs wrapped tightly around the prince's waist, pulling Cassian deeper until there was no air left between them. They moved together in perfect, feverish harmony. A storm of sweat, gasps, and the desperate friction of two sovereign souls locking together forever. When the climax shattered over them, Cassian buried his face in the crook of Sylvester's neck, a guttural, shattered growl echoing from his chest as he poured himself into Sylvester. Sylvester dug his nails deep into Cassian's back, his body trembling violently as he rode the blinding peak, a sharp, breathless cry leaving his lips before he collapsed against the prince. For long minutes, the only sound was the crackle of the hearth and their heavy, synchronized breathing. Cassian lay flush against Sylvester, his forehead resting against Sylvester's shoulder, his heart pounding against Sylvester's ribs like a war drum. He gently stroked Sylvester's hair, pressing soft, reverent kisses to his temple. Sylvester opened his eyes, looking up at the vaulted stone ceiling. A lazy, thoroughly satisfied, and breathtakingly arrogant smirk curved his lips. He raised his hand, running his fingers through Cassian's silver hair, gently tugging it until the prince looked up at him. "Well, your highness," Sylvester murmured, his voice husky and dripping with supreme confidence as he lazily tapped Cassian's jaw. "You've officially secured the exclusive rights to the treasurer." Cassian let out a deep, rumbling laugh, his crimson eyes shining with absolute, eternal devotion as he leaned down to kiss Sylvester once more. "Best investment this empire ever made," Cassian whispered. Chapter 15. The Absolute Sovereign. The imperial throne room was cold, silent, and suffocatingly vast. The morning light filtered through the stained-glass dragon windows, casting long, amber and gold beams across the polished obsidian floor. Emperor Aurelius sat high on the dragon throne, his ceremonial robes draped heavily over his aging shoulders. To his left and right stood 24 imperial guards, their spears fixed, their eyes wide with unspoken dread. Standing before the dais were Crown Prince Cassian and Sylvester von Ravenwood. They stood shoulder to shoulder. Cassian wore his dark combat armor, his broadsword resting at his hip, his crimson eyes gleaming with a lethal, protective fire. Sylvester wore an immaculate double-breasted coat of midnight velvet, his slender hands resting casually on the silver handle of his walking cane. They were holding hands, their fingers tightly laced together in open, unapologetic defiance of centuries of imperial tradition. "You stand before the throne," Emperor Aurelius rasped, his deep voice echoing off the high stone arches. "You demand my imperial blessing for a union that has no precedent in the history of Estria. The crown prince, married to the treasurer who controls the nation's purse." The emperor leaned forward, his heavy aura slamming down onto the hall like an iron hammer. "Do you have any idea what the High Council will say? They will claim the treasury has bought the throne. Let them say it." Sylvester spoke, his baritone voice calm, smooth, and entirely devoid of fear. He didn't bow. He didn't flinch under the emperor's pressure. "The High Council's opinions are entirely irrelevant. I've already bought 3/4 of their debt contracts. If a single minister objects to our union, I will audit his estate by noon." Cassian let out a low, dark chuckle, his grip on Sylvester's fingers tightening in intense pride. "Father," Cassian added, his voice carrying the terrifying authority of the empire's greatest military mind, "I do not seek a marriage of political convenience. Sylvester is my equal, my partner, and the only sovereign I will ever answer to. Your approval is a formality of respect, not a request for permission." Emperor Aurelius stared at the two men standing before him. He looked at his son, a wild dragon who had once lived only for blood and war, now completely tamed and fiercely devoted to the sharp-eyed strategist beside him. He looked at Sylvester, a brilliant, pragmatic mastermind who held the entire continent's economy in the palm of his hand without ever raising a blade. A slow, Heavy sigh escaped the emperor's lips, followed by a wry, breathless smile. A formality of respect. Aurelius repeated, shaking his head. Gods help this empire. You have my blessing. Go, before your treasurer charges me rent for sitting on my own throne. 6 months later, the imperial cathedral of the sun had never seen a wedding so grand, nor so utterly breathtaking. The aisle was lined with rare black orchids and white marble pillars. Every Grand Duke, foreign ambassador, and high minister sat in the pews, holding their breath as the two most powerful men on the continent exchanged their vows. Sylvester stood at the altar in a tailored white and gold suit, his dark hair styled back, his icy blue eyes gleaming with absolute victorious brilliance. Cassian stood opposite him in a matching high-collared tunic of black velvet, looking at Sylvester as if the treasurer were the only living god in existence. When the high priest finished the ceremonial words, Cassian pulled Sylvester in by the waist, pressing a deep, passionate kiss to Sylvester's lips that made the entire court erupt into cheers. Sylvester didn't pull back. He wrapped his arms around the crown prince's neck, returning the kiss with equal heat, cementing his place beside the future king before the eyes of the world. 3 years later, the imperial treasury had grown into a colossal, multi-story fortress that governed global commerce with razor-sharp efficiency. Sylvester sat behind his grand obsidian desk, reviewing a stack of foreign trade manifests. He wore a crisp dark jacket, a silver pocket watch chain resting against his waistcoat. On his left ring finger sparkled a heavy band forged of imperial black gold and blue diamond. A nervous foreign diplomat stood trembling before the desk, wringing his hands. Lord Treasurer Sylvester, the diplomat stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. The High Chieftain of the Western Steppes begs for a brief extension on his trade loan. The winter was unusually harsh. Cattle yields were down by 30%. Sylvester set his silver quill down with a quiet, deliberate clink. His icy blue eyes assessed the trembling man, taking in his posture, his honesty, and the genuine desperation in his eyes. Under the old regime, the chieftain would have been stripped of his lands or executed. Sylvester was still decisive, but he was no longer a mindless tyrant of balance sheets. He knew the true value of long-term stability and genuine loyalty. 30%. Sylvester repeated softly, his baritone voice cool, precise, and measured. Your chieftain has paid his installments on time for the past 4 years without fail. I do not penalize honest hardship caused by weather. The diplomat blinked, stunningly caught off guard. My lord! Sylvester picked up his seal and stamped the parchment with a smooth, decisive motion. I will extend the repayment deadline by 4 months, Sylvester declared calmly. The interest rate will remain frozen at 6%. However, in exchange for this leniency, the Western Steppes will provide 500 cavalry horses to the Imperial Guard at base cost by autumn. Is that acceptable? The diplomat gasped, bowing so low his nose nearly touched the carpet. It is more than fair, my lord. It is generous. The High Chieftain will be eternally grateful to Astria. I don't need gratitude, envoy. I need a stable trade partner. Sylvester replied dryly, gesturing toward the door. Send the confirmation papers by tomorrow. Dismissed. As the diplomat practically floated out of the room in profound relief, the heavy oak doors of Sylvester's private study swung open, and Crown Prince Cassian walked in. He wore his golden regent cape, looking broad, imposing, and breathtakingly handsome. Cassian walked behind Sylvester's chair, leaning down to wrap his thick, muscular arms around Sylvester's shoulders, burying his face in the crook of Sylvester's neck with a deep, contented sigh. I heard that, Cassian murmured, his deep voice vibrating against Sylvester's skin, a warm smile touching his lips. Giving leeway to the Western Steppes? You're becoming a remarkably fair sovereign, my love. I am maintaining sustainable revenue. Sylvester corrected smoothly, leaning his head back against Cassian's broad chest, a rare, breathtakingly elegant smirk curving his lips. A bankrupt partner cannot pay interest, Cassian. Cruelty is expensive. Calculated fairness yields a lifetime of profit. Cassian let out a dark, rich laugh. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently turning Sylvester's chin so he could press a deep, lingering kiss to Sylvester's lips. Sylvester met the kiss easily, his hand rising to rest over Cassian's on his shoulder, a soft, genuine warmth melting the sharp edges of his expression. Transmigrated into a doomed novel, meant to be a forgotten pawn, Sylvester had rewritten the entire script with brilliant logic, unmatched intelligence, and an unyielding spine. He had bought the kingdom, conquered its tyrant, and proved that true power knows exactly when to crush an enemy and when to extend a gracious hand. "Ready for dinner, my sovereign?" Cassian whispered softly against Sylvester's jawline. Sylvester closed his ledger with a sharp, satisfying snap, standing up and taking his husband's arm with supreme, unbothered grace. "Lead the way, Cassian." Sylvester smirked. "We have an empire to rule." The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel for more exciting chapters every week. Thank you for your support, and I'll see you in the next video.